Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a special virtual Enlightenment Salon of the United States Transhumanist Party. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II. I'm the chairman of the US Transhumanist Party, and today we have a special Rana. Dr. Fazal Rana is the vice president of research and apologetics at Reasons to Believe. He's senior scientist in research and development at Procter & Gamble. He graduated with highest honors, now university, with a bachelor's of science in chemistry, and he went on to earn a PhD in chemistry with an emphasis in biochemistry from Ohio University, where he was twice awarded the Donald Klippinger Research Award. He pursued postdoctoral studies in the biophysics of cell membranes at the universities of Virginia and Georgia. And he is also the author of a book called Humans 2.0, Scientific, Philosophical, and Theological Transhumanism, where he approaches transhumanism from a Christian conservative perspective, and delve into the central motivation for us having this discussion with Dr. Rana. I'd like to introduce the other participants in this conversation. We have Tom Ross, who is our Director of Sentient Rights Advocacy for the US Transhumanist Party. And Tom and I are going to, with Dr. Rana with regard to each of the talking points, but we have other US Transhumanist Party officers and state, and we also have Micah Redding, who is our advisor on religion, and he is the head of the Christian Transhumanists. We have among our officers Secretary Pavel Ilin, Director of Applied Innovation, David Shoemaker, Dan Elton, who is our Director of Scholarship, John Karatz, our Director of Energy Issues, and Art Ramon Garcia, who is Art of Visual Art. Then from the California Transhumanist Party, Chairman Newton Lee, as well as Inessa Lee. And from the North Carolina Transhumanist Party, we have James Ryan Connolly. And now let us delve into this central motivation. I released a video called, Will the COVID-19 Pandemic Add Credibility to the Transhumanist Movement? And you can find this video in the description for this virtual Enlightenment Salon. And this is a fascinating video because in it, the factual characterizations by Dr. Rana of key transhumanist ideas, as well as technologies that could illustrate the plausibility of a transhumanist future, are quite accurate. Indeed, a transhumanist would disagree with up until about 34 minutes into his 39.5-minute video. So this is a good video to watch, whether or not you agree with his ultimate conclusion, because his characterization of the transhumanist philosophy, of its origins, of its key motivations, is quite accurate. And this is an honest and intellectually fair video about characterizing a position with which Dr. Rana ultimately disagrees. So it's a good example of how one should approach different points of view, in that one should strive to understand them and then identify where one agrees and where one disagrees. And that, I hope, will be the spirit of this conversation. So now I have articulated our first talking point from the US Transhumanist Party side. And Dr. Rana, I'll let you discuss essentially what you were thinking when you were creating this video, and essentially why you came to the conclusion that you ultimately did after doing all of this research.
Yeah, well,
exploration into.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to the time we're going to get a chance to interact. And, you know, I've approached the whole transhumanist movement with an ultimate goal as a conservative evangelical Christian, and that is to actually try to encourage, again, people that are part of my religious community to actually engage the transhumanist idea. So often Christians, at least conservative Christians, have a tendency to either ignore uh, new ideas that on the surface may appear to threaten their faith, with the hope that maybe by ignoring these ideas, they will just simply disappear, or they have a knee-jerk reaction where they condemn without really truly understanding. And so my goal really is to try to educate the Christian community as to what transhumanism is, and really encourage a genuine engagement of the idea. You know, I actually find it remarkable how rapidly transhumanism has moved from arguably the margins of the academy into the mainstream. And it's largely due to some incredible advances happening in biotechnology, biomedicine, bioengineering that are going to be transformative in terms of a really a medical practice in the near future in an exciting way, where a lot of horrific diseases and debilitating injuries are going to finally have effective treatments, maybe even cures for certain genetic disorders. And yet at the same time, this very technology actually now makes it possible to envision how we might enhance human beings, and even go one step further. Could we even use the technology to attain practical immortality? And so in the process of, of engaging transhumanism, I recognize that we all are in agreement that this technology is a wonderful thing, and we want to see the technology deployed to promote human flourishing, to mitigate human suffering. These are wonderful things, and I'm in agreement with anybody that's in agreement that we should be using the technology in that way. I think rightfully so, we do, as human beings, turn to science and technology to solve problems. That's an appropriate, I think, way to view the power of science and technology. And this is something as a Christian I can readily embrace. I think that the motivation behind the transhumanist movement is something as a Christian I can readily agree with. We were chatting off air, that death is wrong, right? We all agree that there's something inherently wrong about death, that we war against death, and that we recognize that the world isn't the way it should be, that there is pain and suffering and injustice in the world, and we want to do whatever we can to correct it. And so there's strong, I think, points of agreement, even in terms of the motivation that Christians would have that align with transhumanism. To me, the place of departure would be, can technology ultimately truly save us? And this is where I am skeptical. It's not to say that I deny that technology can improve the quality of our lives, but I think we also have to have a realistic view of what technology can or can't achieve. And so when I talk about transhumanism as being a false gospel, that those may sound like combative words, but what I'm doing now is speaking the language of a conservative evangelical Christian, where to me, I look at the true source of salvation being the person of Christ, not with what we can accomplish through technology. But I also recognize that as our world becomes increasingly secular, that there are going to be an increasing number of people that will turn to transhumanism as the mode for their salvation, individually as well as for the salvation of the human species. And my concern is, I think technology can do wonderful things. I just don't think technology can ultimately save us. And I think we need to look beyond ourselves and beyond what we can achieve to actually find true salvation. So that would be the point of departure. It would be primarily theological, if you will. So anyway, hopefully that helps to flesh out a little bit of some of the thinking behind my ideas.
Yes, indeed. And I do think that was a great summary of your key points from your video, as well as the areas where we agree and where we disagree. And by the way, I would ask, in the chat, still have issues with a lag in my internet connection, please let me know. Right now, I would like us for his feedback, and then I will feedback, and hopefully by that time my internet connection will improve as well.
Sorry, you broke up. You asking for my feedback?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, I know this has been billed as a debate, but I don't think that's really productive, which is why I invited James and Micah on, because I think it's more important to build bridges right now. There is a tendency for evangelical Christians specifically to generate kind of a fear about transhumanism, and you can understand why. And there can be theological differences here. I personally, for lack of a better word, am a Gnostic. So I would consider the New Testament a false gospel because I see it as written fiction by Romans. But so I don't want to go down that path because there's no productive way, and I don't see that we can really, many minds will be changed. Okay, we're too embedded here, but we're all here together. And I think it's so much more important to find the common ground. Leave our theology, you know, to our community and to our family, and let's get together, because I think transhumanism is a trend that has always been happening, right? We've always been, ever since the bifocal or hearing aids, pacemakers, all these things are enhancing the quality of our life. We have, if you're using a cell phone or a post-it note, you are using the theory of extended mind. You are putting something somewhere so you don't have to keep it in your brain. So in a way, we're all transhumanists. And so the issue, I think, now is that it's become a movement, or people see it as a movement. And when something becomes a movement, even though it's just a natural progression, and now it has a label and a name and people align with it, it invites controversy, it invites fear, really, from people who don't want to see things change, or they see it as a threat to their theology, what have you. So this is happening anyway. The issue is that it's become a movement, that it's become something that we can now label and put a parameter around it to attack. But that's why I consider myself a transhuman, is because it's happening anyway. I joined the party because it was the only platform I saw that addressed the issues that I care about and that my children will be caring about, in 100 years or more. So that's why I joined it. And so I think it's far more important to use this opportunity today to find the common ground, to use Micah and James and Newton and Dr. Rana to talk about how we can combine efforts. Because transhumanism doesn't have to be the extreme caricature that everybody thinks it is, of cyborgs and uploading our minds. Sure, there's always going to be those extremes that happen with any form of progress. But in the aggregate, humanity's quality of life improves, our lifespans extend. So I think it's far more important to find common ground to keep this going, and sure, temper it with our Christian and or Jewish and or Muslim ideals. Temper it, but don't halt it because of these things. It's happening anyway, so trying to halt it it's like being a Luddite. Trying to stop something that's happening anyway is a fool's game, I think. So I would love to maybe really turn this into a positive discussion about finding common ground between the Christian ideals and transhumanism, because I don't think they're very disparate at all. We're talking about extending life. We're talking about all kinds of things that really fall in line with what Jesus would have done. Sentient rights, all of these things are very Christian in a way of thinking, or very Gnostic in my perception. But anyway, so that's what I'd like to do. I'd like to really have a good, positive conversation. I don't want to debate because that never turns out well, because none of us are going to change our minds. And as a Gnostic, or as many people have called me, an antagonistic, because I love to challenge people on these issues, that's not productive here.
Thank you, Tom. it's good that you mentioned Jesus because earlier you were saying that you don't believe in New Testament. You're okay with the Old Testament. But as we know, and Jesus is a big part of Christianity. And in fact, like you mentioned, Jesus wants, in a sense, Jesus is like a doctor, right? He healed a lot of people. With it did well. People can say it's magic, because he didn't reveal how he did it, but he was able to raise the dead. He was able to, make the blind see again. Now today we have technology to make the blind see, right? We cannot raise the dead yet, okay? But so my question to you, Tom, is that why do you think you want to, you kind of like accept the Old Testament but not the New Testament? I want to see why. What's the reason for that?
Well, I didn't necessarily say I accept the Old Testament either. I see that was also edited by Nebuchadnezzar and the Jews in captivity in Babylon for good reason. Nebuchadnezzar considered himself the firstborn son of Marduk. Marduk was humiliated by Inanna. So there has been a concerted effort to erase the goddess in these holy scriptures. And by the time Jesus came along, that continued. There's a mounting evidence, and I don't really want to get too far into this because there's no way to win. There's mounting evidence that Flavius, Josephus, Titus, these Roman cats edited the Gospels. When the temple was razed, they took the Torah and the Holy Scriptures, hid them away, rewrote them, and had a major campaign to destroy all Holy Scriptures throughout the empire. They basically turned Jesus from a warring rebel. They took the Jewish Messianic movement from being a militaristic endeavor, which threatened the empire, and turned Jesus into a passive, cheek-turning, rendering unto Caesar type of leader. And so that's just where I'm coming from. Now I completely understand and love the Christian story of it. I married into the Jewish faith, so I have an understanding of the Torah. But as a Gnostic, there's really no common ground here to have a serious debate, because I do see it as a rewritten, redacted version of Holy Scriptures. And but I have all due respect for people who are Christians who believe it. I was brought up that way. And so that's not really what I think is productive to discuss today. What I do want to find is a way for Christians to not fear transhumanism, but to embrace it in a way. And this isn't really a Gnostic versus Christian argument here. So that's where I'm coming from.
Yes. Thank you, Tom. Hopefully my connection has improved by now. I will say, from what remarks I can fit in, I myself am an atheist. I am not a militant atheist in the sense that I don't wish to deconvert anyone from their religious perspectives. But my motivation for being a transhumanist is what is expressed in this book, Death is Wrong. It's the first illustrated children's book on indefinite life extension. So I will hopefully get some clearer audio soon, but let's go to Dr. Rana for your thoughts on what's been said so far.
Yeah, well, I very much appreciate Tom's perspective, and I'm glad that he is looking to make this a productive conversation, because that's my goal as well. And and I think that our theological commitments can at times essentially prevent us from finding common ground, and so I think it is wise to maybe set those theological commitments on the shelf and look for places where we actually do find agreement, and use that as a way to forge ahead. But I also would point out that I think it's also our theological commitments do influence how we do look at things, and different theological perspectives can bring value to the table. So, for example, as somebody who's a conservative evangelical, I'm very much in favor of science and technology, and as I've already mentioned. But I also have this deep, sense that human beings are unique and exceptional, because I hold to the view that human beings are created in God's image. Now, the way that cashes out is that because of that, then I would argue that every human life has inherent worth and value. And that when we move forward developing technologies, we want to make sure that we are very sensitive to issues of injustice and equitable distribution and access to emerging technologies. And I'm not saying transhumanists don't share those concerns. I want to make sure that human beings are not exploited in the process of developing and deploying these technologies. But I also, at the same time, want to make sure that we are aggressive at doing everything we can to promote human flourishing, to mitigate pain and suffering. I also recognize, again, this is my theological commitment, that human beings have a propensity to do horrible things sometimes, using the best of what we have and somehow finding ways to turn the best of what we do to horrible ends. As a conservative Christian, I would say that that's our sin nature. And so I think conservative evangelicals can bring to the table this point of caution, saying, let's make sure that we are looking for ways to prevent the abuse of technology, the misuse of technology, so that certain people gain advantage over other people. So I do think our theological commitments can shape discussions in terms of how we move forward, where, yes, indeed, maybe we do have differing perspectives, but by bringing those differing perspectives to the table, I think it helps us at least express towards one another points of caution, helps to create a pathway by which we can move forward in the best possible way. So I actually don't see the evangelical voice as being counterproductive by saying, wait a minute, let's make sure that we're not placing undue confidence in what science and technology can accomplish. Make sure we are paying attention to unintended consequences. Make sure that we're paying attention to the misuse of technology and issues relating to justice and, again, human dignity.
Well, you do say that theology informs how we approach these things. And I would argue that the evangelical, specifically, or Christian bent, the way it informs its approach to transhumanism or any technology, it's coming from a place of fear. Now, I know that's going to be, debated, but in my point of view, I don't believe I do believe in God. I do believe in a goddess. I do believe in a Christ, with my Gnostic understanding of things. So, I'm not an atheist, but I'm also I don't think a God that requires its followers to be fearful or to worship it, who is insecure enough to need fear and to be worshiped, is worth worshiping, And so when you come to it from this Roman version of Christianity, you are trained, or you become fearful of a God. You become, set and rules, and you want to put the brakes on things. So that is it's a valuable thing. Let's not get out of hand here. I mean, it's a very valuable thing, but it can go a little bit too far. And that's why I think we should really try to keep this out of the theology and this argument, well, as much as we can, because we are talking with Christians and talking about transhumanism. But there's also the aspect of the anthropomorphism of the thing, in that we are exceptional. And I agree, but at the same time, that to me feels an immature place to be. If you look, and granted, I'm a human, I want my children to do well, I want to do well, but if you look at the net of our of what we have done with this planet as being its masters or its potential, possible stewards, we've not done very well at that, because we think we're exceptional. And now, if you look at the deer in my backyard, if you look at any other species on this planet, which we have not made extinct so far, we are a net negative. And we are not good stewards. That was what we were supposed to be, right? We have not done well at that job. And so this anthropomorphism, anthropocentrism is also, I think, folly, because we put ourselves above all else, and it's not restricted to Christians or evangelicals, this sense of being exceptional. It's rampant in the transhumanist movement. People want to become immortal, and they want to extend their lives radically, but there's no balancing effort to control population. So the longer we live, the more damage we will do, the more waste we will produce, and then maybe we'll just go to another planet and be like a virus on that one too. But that's kind of an immature approach to think we are special, and we're afraid of change. And so it's a vicious cycle. So without a conscious effort, an equal effort to control population, life extension is an egocentric desire.
I think, Tom, this is where you and I will disagree. And I myself, of course, as the author of Death is Wrong, do see life extension as the foremost goal of transhumanism. Now, there are other goals as well in improving the human condition, improving human quality of life. But I do think largely overpopulation is a myth, that our resources that are available for human use are a function of our technological capabilities. And thus far, our technological capabilities have more than kept up with human population growth and the demand on resources. But these are conversations that are being had within the transhumanist community, as well as outside of it. Now, I want to bring in some comments from Mike Lazine. Mike Lazine writes, I think the issue is with some Christians who think it is meant for humans to die, and their God never intended mankind to die at 70 or 80, or if you are lucky, 80 plus. And he also notes, so we transhumanists want immortality just as much as Christians do, but Christians want it from a supernatural source and not a technological one. So Mike Lazine, let me know if you heard my narration of your comment. Osunakachi Kalu writes, anthropomorphism is part of nature as our species. It is a kind of mental projection which is common among us. So just some thoughts from our audience. I think now let's go to the participants in the live stream. What questions, comments, feedback do you have regarding what's been said so far?
Well, I just had I guess I wanted to say, I agree completely with Dr. Rana that our ethics is very important here, and transhumanism, in my mind, is somewhat uncoupled from ethics. So, for instance, there's some transhumanists who are very selfish and are in it merely because they want to live forever, or they want to become more intelligent, or who knows, there could even be some that wish to dominate others. But I don't think any of us are like that, but there are certainly people who get into it for those reasons. Personally, I am a utilitarian, and what kind of drives me in the direction of transhumanism is the desire to reduce suffering, and I believe extending life and health span and biomedicine is all very good. And also, you have David Pierce, who wants to realize the kind of hedonistic imperative, and so there's a variety of ethical views kind of undergirding it, and I think it's interesting to explore that. The other thing is, sorry, just like a little out of it, but I do want to get onto this question about progress, technological progress.
And we will do that soon. I want to bring in a comment from Mike DeVerde, who says, I want super longevity, super intelligence first and foremost. So Mike DeVerde, let me know if you heard that. But those are common desires among transhumanism advocates. So super longevity, super intelligence, super happiness, super abundance in terms of material goods. All of those go together in this kind of future that we're trying to build. So excellent, Mike DeVerde heard me. So this is a good time to introduce our next talking point. And this stems from the last 5.5 minutes of your video, Dr. Rana, where it seems that you made a claim that technology will tend to cause more problems than it solves. And if technology solves certain problems, it will introduce other problems. And it's true that sometimes technology can introduce other problems. But on net, transhumanists hold that the problems caused by new technologies are typically of a milder and more manageable form than the problems that such technologies overcome, with a few notable exceptions. We can cite weapons of mass destruction or engineered pathogens or certain types of surveillance technologies, which could indeed cause more problems than they solve. But those can be rendered obsolete by future waves of technological advancement as well. Think if each country developed a perfectly functioning nuclear defense system. So that system could intercept incoming nuclear missiles with perfect accuracy and deflect this threat of mutually assured destruction. That would be a great advance. And also, this is not to say aware of and try to mitigate the possible risks of certain emerging technologies. Indeed, transhumanists talk about anticipating and mitigating existential risk quite a bit. This is the third core ideal of Transhumanist Party, that we seek to use science, technology, and rational discourse to mitigate and eliminate the risks facing the human species. But this effort of proactive risk mitigation should not discourage us from pursuing those technologies at a rapid pace, because it seems on net, if we keep developing new technologies and we do that prudently, ethically, considering the possible downsides, we'll be in a better position ultimately than if we step back and say, no, we can't go there because of the possible risks, because there is also a risk to inaction. There's a risk of staying at this level of technological advancement or going backward. So Dr. Rana, I'd be curious regarding your thoughts on these points.
Yeah, and I think my position probably didn't come through in its entirety in that video, because as you mentioned, it was the last few minutes of the video, and I was just simply making the point, and maybe I made the point in a little bit too of an extreme fashion in that video. But I go back to a point that I did make earlier, and I think that if I do have quote unquote criticism of transhumanism, I think at times there's at least I get this sense, a bit of a naivety in that technology is ultimately going to be the source of our salvation. I don't deny that technology does drive progress. It does improve the quality of life, but we are always managing consequences. And you bring up the examples of weapons of mass destruction, and in other words, the potential unintended consequences and the misuse of a technology become more frightening, frankly, the more powerful the technology is, and we need to be paying a lot of attention to very powerful technologies. And I think what we're looking at when we are talking now about things like CRISPR gene editing and the types of gene editing techniques that likely will emerge out of the insights from CRISPR gene editing technology, or what's happening with computer brain interface technologies. These are incredibly powerful technologies that are becoming remarkably accessible to the point where you see the grinder movement and the biology DIY movement. That's just absolutely mind-boggling to me, where these technologies are no longer necessarily in the hands of the scientific and the technological elite, right? Who who've undergone extensive training in terms of maybe how to think about these kinds of advances, where the average person on the street can gain access to the technology and begin to deploy it to modify themselves or to modify others. And again, the consequences of misusing the technology are very powerful. And so that's really the crux of my point is the more powerful the technology, the more attention that we have to pay. And you know, in terms of kind of the principle that I like to approach these kinds of assessments with is kind of a blend of the precautionary principle and the precautionary principle. I'm actually very sympathetic to the point that I've heard a number of transhumanists make, and that is that if we don't, what is the risk of not pursuing the technology, right? And I agree with that there is a downside if we don't pursue CRISPR gene editing. There's a downside if we don't pursue computer-brain interface technology that has real consequences for real people's lives. And so I'm very much sympathetic to that point. And I do agree that by exploring technology in a responsible way, we can begin to flesh out, you know, undesirable or unintended consequences. We can learn how to manage it if we are, again, progressing at a deliberate, thoughtful pace. But at the same time, I think there is value in the precautionary principle saying maybe there are actually lines that we should never even approach, let alone cross. And again, this requires a lot of wisdom on the collective part of so many people. And I think what really is, you know, again, giving me some pause for thought is how fast the technology is developing in gene editing, in computer-brain interface, in anti-aging technologies as a collective. They're progressing so fast that we don't have the proper time to really even necessarily understand them, let alone have any kind of, you know, ethical deliberation about what is it that we should or shouldn't be doing with this technology. And so, you know, that to me is where I think the precautionary principle does have value, you know, in this process.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Rana. And these are very interesting thoughts. Again, I think most transhumanists would find little to disagree with in what you said, and that we need to actively contemplate technologies and be intelligent about how to deploy them. But it's still, I think, important to have a rapid pace of technological deployment and to figure out through these conversations how we can do that with the best effect for humanity and avoiding the possible downsides. So now let's go to Tom Ross for his feedback on what has been discussed.
Well, just in general, as you were talking, I felt like I could exchange the word technology in your comments with the word religion. Even to the point of transhumans are naive. I'm sure many transhumans would think that people with Christian beliefs are naive. And when you talk about technology, when it gets too big, can get out of hand, or there's unintended consequences. This is what we've seen historically with religion. I think more people have died by the hands of religious ideals than have by transhumanist invention. And it's also, I really want to try not to get into this place of tit for tat and making comments about, you know, because we're not going to find common ground here if we talk in any way negative about either of our sides. And I'm sure that I'll be inviting all kinds of, I'll be the fall guy for all kinds of stuff as the Gnostic in the group. I'm used to that. I'm a heretic. But this is why I would really love to hear James and Newton and Micah talk more about this, because I tend to get a little antagonistic, as I say. And I think it's much more productive to find the common ground between transhumanism and Christianity here today.
James, we haven't heard from you yet, so do you have any thoughts on this question of technology and whether it causes more problems than it solves, or solves more problems than it causes, and how we should approach that while still seeking the acceleration of technological progress?
Yes, I guess I do. So I don't know, there's a lot to unpack here. But I think it's mainly a question of identity, semantics, and absolutes. Kind of a triangulation. I've got a whiteboard over here, so I kind of drew that on the board. You know, at once we have the identity of faith, you know, and its multiform, I guess, celebration of, you know, different beliefs. And then we also have the identity of the Transhumanist Party itself, and we have to make some absolutes because they have names, and so then we get into semantics. And so, you know, when I was preparing for this, I thought it was interesting. I'm not a Catholic, but I was raised Catholic. I'm a Christian, but I also consider myself to be, and I am a devout member of other faiths, and a lot of Christians don't understand how that can fit together. You know, so I guess I just wanted, I want to start real quick just with a joke, actually. You know, Mike DeVerde asked a question earlier, and Mike DeVerde is a good friend of mine now, but we were kind of butting heads at one point, and he talked about life and intelligence. Well, you know, as a Christian or you know, a Jewish perspective, you know, or even an Islamic perspective, you know, the Garden of Eden had those two opposing poles, you know, if you will. You got life and intelligence, and you know, I think that that's interesting that he brought that up. So it made me think of a quote from my father, actually, my dad. You know, he always told me when I was a kid. He said, "Son," said, "everybody likes a little ass, but nobody likes a smart ass." So I think that I'd like to throw that at Mike DeVerde just as a joke, because I'm glad we're friends now, but also at Tom, because he's a Gnostic, you know, so he's focused, you know, on Gnosticism and revelation and everything. And, you know, that's all well and great. And, you know, there's a lot of secret stuff kind of in Christianity. Paul talks about, you know, ears to hear and eyes to see, and that kind of thing. And, you know, so there's a lot there. And you know, so, but the thing is, you know, let me just I just want to share 3 quotes. I don't want to get too much into my own beliefs because they differ with pretty much every transhumanist I've met. I believe that personal immortality is redundant, because I believe that I am an immortal being and I'm saved by Christ. And so I believe that personal immortality is redundant. If it was on the table, if it was offered to me, I don't know if I'd take it. You know, I don't know. Maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't. It depends on the context. But, you know, when I was researching, kind of preparing, I didn't have much time, but when I was trying to prepare for this, you know, I actually found myself drawn to the 2 Christians that really I was drawn to were actually, they're Catholics. And, you know, so obviously the Catholic faith has its own, or Catholic institution has its own set of problems and difficulties throughout history and all that kind of thing. You know, and but one of them is actually I'm a descendant of a Passionist priest, a monk. His name is Thomas Berry. He's my great uncle. And he writes in the Great Work. He writes, this is like a 1-line quote here, so I'm trying to make this quick. He writes, because of our need to fuel the industrial world, we have created a technosphere incompatible with the biosphere. Now, you know, don't extrapolate that into his whole views. They're very complex. Thomas Berry's was, and he wasn't saying that we need to regress from technology, you know, but he was also the director of the Teilhard Institute in New York, and he was a scholar of Eastern studies, and he was a polymath in his own right, and he was very, I guess he's a multi-faith type guy, synthesizing, you know, East and West and Judaism, Christianity, things like that, you know. So anyway, so that's one perspective, and this is in a book called The Great Work, which is about moving ahead into the future as a human race. And let's see. So the second quote that I wanted to share is from Teilhard, and he says, "All right. To sum up, if social totalization and scientific technology are regarded as they should be, as constituting a direct prolongation in a human context of the grand process of the vitalization of matter, capital M, it follows that from the coming of man, biological evolution not only rebounds on a new scale and with new resources, but that it rebounds reflectively upon itself. The Darwinian era of survival by natural selection, aka the vital thrust, as he calls it, is thus succeeded by a Lamarckian era of superlife brought about by calculated invention, the vital impulse. In man, evolution is interiorized and made purposeful. And at the same time, in the degree in which the strivings of human inventiveness need to be controlled in their operation and sustained in their energies, it imposes upon itself a moral order and mysticizes itself. So, you know, Richard Dawkins talks about how Darwinian evolution is pretty much a thing of the past as far as from a temporal aspect. You know, of course, that doesn't take into consideration gene editing, things like that. You know, he talks about mimesis. He talks about the evolution occurring through the social, to throw another Teilhard word in there, through the noosphere, I guess, if you will, and the development of social endeavors, you know, the fine arts, if you will, etc. You know, so like I said, it's mainly I think a problem of identity here, and so my perspective is, like I said, I think that that the third pillar of the foundation of transhumanism that you mentioned, being, you know, being foresight for our future and preventing you know, calamity, but you know, Thomas Berry is about conservation, you know, being one with the biosphere and learning from nature, learning from creation, capital C, you know, how to go about the human endeavor, how to use technology, because technology, you know, I mean, technology actually, personally, it starts in the genes. I mean, you look at beavers, spiders, field mice, you know, actually what they build, you know, we would think of, you know, building structures as a technology, but they actually, it's a phenotype for organisms, which I think is pretty interesting. I think language is actually a technology. It's a subconscious technology to some degree. But anyway, so, you know, and I'm finishing up here. I'm sorry for talking so long. So, you know, the church has a duality to it, you know, in the church, you have the mystic heart, and then you also, it has to clothe itself in a pragmatic utilitarian exterior. You know, how do we do our day-to-day operations? How do we raise money? How do we spread the word? You know, and, you know, but at the heart, you have these mystics like Teilhard, you know, like Thomas Berry was a mystic. I consider myself a mystic. You know, the Gnostics were mystics. And so, and they clothe that experience that it's hard to put into words in different ways. And, you know, so, you know, it all goes back to Prometheus. It's like, all right, we have this great power before us, and it's, you know, we're either knocking on heaven's door or we're knocking on hell's door. You know, which one is it going to be? You know, and they go back to the Old Testament. You know, Cain and Abel, you know, that their technology was all throughout Cain and Abel. You know, he used a rock to kill them, and, you know, one was tilling the ground, one was using the technology of corrals, you know, to corral, you know, and I mean, that's the technology of society, hunter-gatherer, you know, you've got the development of society along with tilling the ground, settling in place, you know, all of that. And then he uses a simple rock to kill his brother, you know, and that's like a regression. It's using, you know, it's like, it's stoning. You know, it goes back to the New Testament as well. You know, it's like, you know, we can use technology for good, just like we can use nature for bad. And so Tim Shell, thou mayest, you know, thou mayest. So I think that, you know, the problem is, I promise I'm gonna finish up now. The problem is, like, you know, personally as a Christian, and, you know, Dr. Rana, I started reading Who Was Adam last night, and wow, I was really, really, really impressed with it. I didn't get very far into it because I didn't have much time, but I really like your perspectives and the way you think and everything. What was I gonna say? totally
So
derailed. I'm sorry. I'm
let,
done.
let me bring in a request from Mike DeVerde with regard to the quotations that you provided. Could you please post them on the US Transhumanist Party Facebook group, just so that the other members can see them? But I wanted to make a few comments regarding some of the points you raised. So the Chardin quote about evolution essentially being transcended, the Darwinian evolution being transcended by a kind of Lamarckian evolution, where human beings, through technology, through societal norms, through cultural progress, take control of the evolutionary process. That's very much a key idea in transhumanism, that we don't have to resign ourselves to the very costly and wasteful and cruel and arbitrary process of biological evolution. We can find a more humane approach which respects the individual. And I think that's the key ethical principle in transhumanism: respect for the individual, the desire to preserve the individual. Now, there are different views as to what constitutes preservation of the individual. So clearly, a lot of Christians, at least most Christians, believe in some sort of afterlife. And I know that actually many Christians have a kind of misconception about what Christianity states about the afterlife. They think it's some ethereal other realm, but really the resurrection in Christian theology, per my understanding, is supposed to be resurrection in the flesh. So that's interesting as well. That's not necessarily in conflict with transhumanist aspirations. The Russian cosmist movement, for instance, Nikolai Fyodorov, one of the great progenitors of this kind of thinking, and I could say a great proto-transhumanist, articulated this desire to revive every single person who ever lived through future technologies. So that's an example of the transhumanist ethos, essentially being very much aligned with the goal of preserving the individual, of getting even the individuals who have died before to come back. Cryonics is another example of a field which is embraced by many transhumanists, where there is this motivation. If somebody encounters legal death by today's standards, that is indeed not the end, according to some cryonicists, because future technologies can revive that person physically in the flesh. So it seems to me that there are these means that transhumanists have articulated, which could very much be aligned with the goals that a lot of Christians espouse. And as long as you believe that some resurrection in the flesh is what's going to happen, and you're not just going to be a spirit in some otherworldly realm, transhumanist technologies should very much be of interest to someone who is a Christian. So, Dr. Rana, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, yeah, those are really interesting points. And you know what you're pointing out is there are these remarkable parallels between transhumanism and between Christianity, and that was something that really struck me very early on when I began exploring in depth transhumanism, and again, how should I, as a conservative evangelical, engage the transhumanist idea. And I think that parallel that you see really serves us as an opportunity to find, again, common ground and common points of agreement. And I think it's exposing this idea that really the ultimate motivations that transhumanism has aligns remarkably well with the ultimate motivations of Christianity, which is, again, this recognition that there is a destiny and a larger purpose and meaning, I think, to human existence and to the existence of the human species, that there is a hope, a purpose, and a destiny that resides in all of our hearts that we want to see fulfilled. And I think that the difference would be how the mode or the means by which we attain that hope, purpose, and destiny. Is it going to be, again, through technology exclusively, or is it going to be through the advent of Christ, the second advent of Christ? There's a I'm a biochemist, not a theologian, so bear with me here as I make this point. But when it comes to Christianity, there was this idea of the kingdom of God, that the kingdom of God was ushered in with the coming of Christ, and that as Christians, our job is to live our lives according to the principles of the kingdom of God, and that in doing so, we represent kind of a pointer to what is to come as a Christian community, that we give a foretaste of what is to come, and that we are, again, to do what we can to live our lives according to kingdom principles. And this means that science and technology development is very much part of the Christian mission, I believe, particularly when it's aligned with improving the quality of people's lives, again, promoting human flourishing, mitigating human suffering. The recognition, however, is this, that we cannot ultimately produce the ultimate consummation of the kingdom of God through our own efforts, that ultimately that consummation is going to be realized with the second coming of Christ. And so that consummation is in the person of Christ. But all that to say that this actually is not setting Christianity at odds with transhumanism, but it's essentially pointing out that there's much that we share in agreement. There's much that we see aligning ourselves, and that that I think something that speaks to this idea of human exceptionalism is, I think, we're talking about the fact that we're now, as human beings, ushering in a different era of evolution, where it's evolution that's under our control. And this is not only with regard to human evolution, this is with regard to the evolution of all life on Earth. That we have this capacity now to usher in this completely new era, and that we seem to be the only species that has ever existed that even has that capacity. And I think in and of itself, that speaks to our exceptional nature. But then on top of that, the whole idea, of that death is wrong, really, and that there's something tragic when an individual dies, that there's something tragic when we contemplate the prospects of humanity going extinct, that suggests that we all intuitively recognize that there again is something exceptional about us, so much so that we would desire to see individuals and and humanity being preserved, and so we desire to see that preservation again, and so it's just that I just don't think that as somebody who embraces the historic Christian faith, that I could see technology or humanity actually triggering the consummation of the kingdom of God. I think that has to be in the coming of Christ. That's the place where I would say I have a departure, but we're sharing a long path towards that final eschatology, if you will, and I think this is good news in that there's a lot that I can embrace genuinely and sincerely that transhumanism advocates for, even to the point of, again, pursuing aggressively, emerging technologies.
Micah, it seems like you have some thoughts in response to this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I probably have a religious context that's much closer to Dr. Rana's religious context than some of the others that have been expressed here. And so a lot of that resonates with me. And I'm someone who sees Christianity as calling us to transhumanism. I think there's a reason for these similarities and overlaps. It's historical and theological and all of these kinds of things. and so I think Dr. Rana alluded to earlier, there's science and technology do have a theological basis in the Christian faith, right? We call that in Christian terms the dominion mandate or the cultural mandate, this idea that God put us here to cultivate and bring life to the earth and create new things, and that this is one of the primary purposes for human existence. And so one thing that I thought was really good to highlight here was this idea of is transhumanism a false gospel? Is it offering salvation without Christ, right? Which would be the key thing for most Christians, right? Is this a way to get outside of having the need for Christ, or having something like that? And I think that's a good thing for to tie together a few different things that have been brought up here. So from a Christian perspective, we're called to feed the hungry and clothe the naked, right? But we wouldn't say those are false gospels, because we recognize that they need more than just food and they need more than just clothing, right? But they could be a false gospel if we thought that alone was all they needed, right? So Jesus tells us to feed the hungry and clothe the naked, but also that man does not live by bread alone. Like, we need something more than that. And I think I've heard that expressed by many people in this conversation, that we also need some kind of a spiritual or ethical principle to drive us, right? To unite our aspirations, to make sense of the context we're in. And I think Dan Elton pointed out that transhumanism typically floats around with several different kind of ethical ideas, right? That are available, from what I call radical environmentalism of David Pierce and others who want to ease the suffering of the whole biosphere, which sounds a lot like a Christian vision of lions and lambs, right? All the way to kind of radical humanitarianism, all the way to radical egoism, which we see in some contexts. So we all want some kind of ethical principle to connect how do we use this technology? How do we drive it? How do we make choices? And I think that's where, in that kind of span of different kinds of ethical and spiritual ideas that are floating around, Dr. Rana and I would, I think, share the aspiration that Christians can come into that and say, well, here's what discipleship of Christ would lead us to do with these technologies. Here's what discipleship of Christ would lead us to pursue the development of, or prioritization of. So that's kind of my response or feelings about what's been said so far. I think there's a lot of overlap here for some really good reasons, and I think that's a really interesting point of discussion.
Yes, great remarks, Micah. And Dr. Rana, what are your thoughts in response?
Well, I thought Micah did a really better job maybe than I did in articulating, I think, some of the motivations that Christians have with regard to science and technology. So yeah, nothing much really to offer by way of a rejoinder or a reaction, other than very impressed with how articulate Micah was in laying out those ideas. And also establishing, I think, the points of connection in terms of what are the meta themes that are coming out of this conversation.
Excellent. So thank you, Dr. Rana. And again, thank you to Micah. I think we've covered a lot of the talking points that were brought up in this conversation. So for instance, this whole false gospel idea, and whether transhumanism necessarily is a false gospel, or if it could be reconciled with Christianity. We've heard some really thought-provoking conversations on this, and it does appear to me that it's at least theoretically possible to reconcile Christianity and transhumanism, and there are many Christians who are doing this right now as we speak. But I wanted to go to the next talking point, because I think it is a natural bridge from this conversation. And that is, Dr. Rana, your characterization of Christianity appears to be one that represents a certain stage of Christianity's historical evolution. And I think it's a very forward-thinking type of Christianity in certain respects, in that it does embrace technology. It speaks to some of the same ethical questions and considerations that we transhumanists have been exploring. But also, it's true that this is not the Christianity of the 3rd century or the 16th century. Even if one considers there have been so many different denominations of Christianity or Christian churches, each of which has interpreted major ethical questions about how we should live our lives in this world in different ways. So, as I like to say, religions evolve too. And religions evolve in response to technological change, in response to change in societies and political structures, in people's attitudes toward life. And there may be something more fundamental that essentially influences how religions evolve and leads to the fact that Christianity today is quite unlike Christianity in the 3rd century. So that leads me to think that this evolution is going to continue in the future. And as these emerging technologies are deployed, which you have so articulately outlined, there could be a theological evolution of Christianity, which would lead Christians to ultimately embrace transhumanism as a more mainstream interpretation of Christianity. So let's say we figure out a way to talk to a Christian in the year 2100, and that Christian will say, well, of course, it's the will of God that we should all be living to at least 200 years old, and we can be doing all these good works with our time in the name of God. That's just a hypothetical Christian perspective from the year 2100, but I don't see why that wouldn't be the case. So, Dr. Rana, what are your thoughts on these points?
Yeah, well, I'll offer my perspective, and I would really love to hear Micah and Newton and James weigh in too. To me, I look at Christianity as actually being fairly static in terms of its core beliefs over the last 2 centuries, or last 2 millennia. I apologize. In the sense that there is this mere Christianity, or this idea of creedal Christianity, where if you look at the Apostles' Creed, even though Christianity today looks very differently in terms of its expression than it did maybe at the time of the Apostles, there still is a commitment to the Apostles' Creed and to the other great creeds of the church. This idea of, again, mere Christianity, and the expression of Christianity, however, again, is very different. Or when you look at the different Christian denominations or Christian traditions, again, there's the core set of beliefs that all would ascribe to, yet at the same time there are different expressions of the faith from denomination to denomination, from tradition to tradition. And so I think what you're looking at is, in ascribing to kind of the evolution of Christianity, is really more the evolution of the expression of the faith as opposed to the core tenets of the faith. And I think there are, a lot of aspects of transhumanism that could be, I think, legitimately appropriated into Christian theology. That's part of the work of systematic theology, is how do you engage ideas from science and philosophy and culture and history with biblical theology. And so I can see places where, again, transhumanism could influence Christian theology, but I still think that there's going to be these core, creedal components of Christianity that will not change. And if there are ideas in transhumanism that do butt against those creedal ideas, I think that's a place where you would always see points of tension or points of disagreement. But I could easily envision a world where much of the transhumanist ideals would be readily shared and appropriated, by Christians, particularly when it comes to, again, carrying out activities that we would argue would be mandates of the kingdom of God. Or, again, I thought Micah's idea of, we're, commanded to clothe those who are naked and to feed the poor and to comfort those who are sick. And technology is a great way for us to achieve those biblical mandates. But we never ever want to stop short saying that the only way that we're going to again bring about the kingdom of God is through these kinds of activities. There's always going to be this transcendent element to Christianity. There's always going to be this idea that ultimately our hope and our salvation is not in this arena, but it's going to be into what is going to come, into the future times that are not of our own invention again, but are going to be that which is ushered in through the second coming of Christ.
Newton, what are your thoughts on this?
Yes, I totally agree. This is amazing. Well, first of all, I can say that I'm a fundamentalist Christian. So I agree that the core value of Christianity never changed since day one. Okay, the evolution that United is talking about, yes, there's evolution in organized religion. Organized religion based on the Old Testament, the New Testament, and so on. That's why we have so many denominations. So personally, I've been involved. I've been to many different churches, from Orthodox Church to Baptist, Methodist, and also the Pentecostals. Okay, so each denomination, each organized religion each focuses on certain things. They like to, for example, Pentecostal focuses very much on the spiritual expression. You can speak in tongues, you can do all kinds of miracles, so to speak. Now, I'm not saying that they actually succeed in doing all that, but they at least they try. And then, of course, they have the liberals, you have conservatives within the Christian religion. So I really don't like to label people because each of us has liberal views as well as conservative views. But I do believe in what Jesus says. Of course, there's also a debate that Tom earlier was talking about, whether the New Testament is authentic or whether it has been subject to a lot of changes. Sure, I mean, there are, there can be changes, obviously. But if you think about it, what Jesus was, I believe, the New Testament does tell us what Jesus really is. Okay. And because of that, I think there's no contradiction. There's no, I mean, for example, let's take the big question of creationism versus evolution, right? Even way before transhumanism, you have, science and technology. You have, we understand atoms and we understand universe better. It's all way before, transhumanism. People was already talking about, well, maybe we shouldn't believe in God because there's science. How can we prove the existence of God with science? Well, obviously we cannot, right? Because science is a tool and it's limited by our mind. There's no way to prove the existence or non-existence of God using a microscope or, general theory of relativity or whatever you have. So it's not possible, but doesn't mean that God doesn't exist, right? Like people have emotions. We are still trying to understand about human emotions. And that's why we do artificial and general intelligence. We try to mimic, humanity, that is not just 1 + 1 = 2, which is logic. Okay, so with logic, you have emotion, you have spiritual sides of things, with physical side of things. So if you look at Jesus, he healed people. He was like a doctor. He was healing people physically, but that's not salvation. Salvation is more than healing people physically. He's talking about, believing in God, love one another, right? Love is the biggest, commandment of all, right? So that's why he, basically says that all the Old Testament, all the rules and regulations are outdated because, by following the rules and regulations, if you don't love people, it's totally, not Christian-like. It's totally, not God-like. And God created people in the image of God. So we have to invent things because God is very inventive. First of all, I mean, we all know God invented people. That's amazing, you know. And God invented, the earth, all the animals, all the amazing nature. So here we are inventing artificial intelligence, and we're inventing a lot of things, computers and so on and so forth. So it doesn't negate anything at all. We are just doing what God intended us to do because we are created in the image of God. So having said that, there's absolutely no contradiction between transhumanism and Christianity. And I think that's, that is a good, starting point, or, how we continue on developing technology without, we're still keeping the faith of Christianity, while at the same time, we're advancing the transhumanism to give people super longevity. Now, we, as long as we have physical body, we cannot be immortal. But if you look at it, Jesus, after resurrection, he was able to eat. He was able to be touched by disciples. So he did have a physical body after resurrection, but we don't know what the DNA was like. What was the DNA of the resurrected Christ? We don't know, but maybe this is what we are trying to find out with transhumanism. It's having the new DNA that give us, immortality, but at the same time, it needs to be grounded in the faith of Christianity.
It looks like Dan Elton has some thoughts on this as well.
I want to go back to where I do actually see a little bit of tension, which is on this notion of the desirability of technological, the question of the desirability of technological progress. We have quite an interesting panel here, because we have 4 Christian transhumanists who all have shown a lot of respect for technology, and I think are very forward thinking, and I commend all of you. But my feeling is that with a lot of Christians, they sort of feel like the world is sort of doomed, right? And I wonder, and that's where I think I would like to see more, and I think the key question here is whether technology is ultimately, like, where it's going, right? And I think a lot of us, one point I was going to make earlier was a lot of, I've been a transhumanist about 10 years, and I got into it through Ray Kurzweil. And my experience is a lot of people about my age got into transhumanism through Ray Kurzweil. And if you listen to him, it is sort of like he's preaching a gospel that this singularity is inevitable, right? That we just have to strap in our seatbelts, and 30 years from now, we're either going to be uploading our brains into computers, or we're going to be augmenting our genes to live longer. And there's this sort of, if you read his books, there's this sort of idea that we're on this trajectory, this exponential trajectory, and it's almost inevitable. But I think, and I believe there's still a lot of people in transhumanism who follow that, but I believe a lot of us have sort of matured past that, where we realize technology does create a lot of problems, like especially these existential risk concerns now that, and the ones that worry me a lot are the risk of bioterrorism and artificial intelligence, creating super intelligent AI. And but I am still so I just want to say, yeah, there are people for who it is sort of this, there is sort of this feeling like we are going to be saved by technology. Kind of, there's this inevitable progression. But I think I feel like that was more prominent about 5-10 years ago, and a lot of people are sobering up now to this existential risk concerns and that. But I am still optimistic, I guess, because if you look at all the curves, you know, like Steven Pinker has, things are getting better. And but at the same time, I agree, there's always going to be problems. A philosopher I like, a scientist I like is David Deutsch, and he points out problems are solvable, right? And I think that's the kind of spirit you need, is that there's always going to be problems, but these problems are solvable if we put our minds to it. And hopefully, you know, maybe we can augment our intelligence a bit so we can better handle these problems. I mean, evolution didn't really prepare us for the world we're going into. So that's kind of an argument for transhumanism right there. Anyway, I think that this is sort of the crux, though, which is the desirability of technological progress, and whether it just creates more problems than it solves, or whether there is a progression. I tend to believe it's more of a progression. Things are going to get better and better. Then we should kind of go full steam ahead. But I believe it's an open question, and I believe it's an understudied question. We don't even really have good metrics for it, you know. So I'd love to hear Dr. Rana's elaborate a bit more, because I think that's where there's some tension, perhaps.
Yeah, well, Dan, I appreciate those comments, and I think, in a sense, I would agree with you that maybe the place where there's going to be the ultimate point of maybe tension would be just really how much can technology truly, you know, usher in something that approximates a utopian type of future. Can technology really grant us, you know, at least practical immortality? I think that's really, at the end of the day, kind of the point where the tension really resides. And you know, my sneaking suspicion is that I don't think technology ultimately is going to be able to truly save us, or ultimately be able to truly create a utopian future. But I actually have learned a lot today, in the sense that I appreciate the fact that people that are espousing transhumanism are actually much more cognizant of quote unquote the myth of progress. You know, and is that myth of progress true, or is it something that is actually, you know, quote, you know, mythical, I guess. So I really actually appreciate that, and draw a lot of encouragement from that. And I think that, in light of the fact that this is where the tension lies, you know, in a practical sense, I think this is where I think differing worldview and philosophical perspectives really become extremely valuable, because everybody now is going to bring to the table, I think, have a different vantage point in terms of how aggressive we should be, you know, how much resources we should devote in terms of characterizing a technology before we progress it. Where are the boundaries? And this is where I think the conversations actually have to happen in order for us to really move towards a future that, again, is a future of progress. As a Christian, again, I'm all for using technology to improve the world that we live in. I want to see technology bring us as close to a genuine utopia as possible. That's my motivation, as somebody who wants to see the kingdom of God realized here on earth. But again, as somebody who is an evangelical, you know, my ultimate concern is that people actually are in a right relationship with their Creator through the person of Christ. And yet I think there's a lot with transhumanism that actually makes it easier for me to discuss the idea of the gospel, in the sense that, again, transhumanism is bringing to the forefront the idea that things really aren't the way they're supposed to be, that death is unnatural, right? That we desire something beyond what this life seemingly offers us. And I admire the fact that that people want to roll up their sleeves and do what they can, in the here and the now, using the tools of science and technology to make the world better. I can only throw my hat into that arena, right? I can only cheer people on who want to do those very things. And again, in the fact that my perception of naivety on the part of transhumanists is actually an unsubstantiated perspective is really good news to me.
Yeah, I like I said, I think the movement used to be a lot more naive, but at least for me, and I think a lot of other people, this growing concern about existential risk, I like what Nick Bostrom has been talking about, who's very influential in our movement. That has really given a lot of people pause. I believe that progress is real. I believe in that the Enlightenment was the beginning of mankind's progression, and that was sort of kicked off progress in both ethics and in science and knowledge. So I believe that progress is real, and it's been working so far, but the question is it inevitable that it will continue on and on and on to this great future where we're going to be going out in the universe? And with the realization of existential risk concerns, I think a lot of people are questioning that, including myself, because if we all die in a bioterrorism incident, I mean that's the end right there. Or you could have another scenario would be a great catastrophic risk, which say wipes out a large number of people and essentially leads to a collapse in civilization. And then if there's a collapse in civilization, I mean that could go on for a very long time, and then you might end up in sort of a cyclical situation where things get up to a certain level, and then there's some catastrophe and everything regresses back, right? So yeah, I think people are at least I have sobered up a lot, and reading about existential risk, but most transhumanists I know still believe that we should be pushing for technological progress because first of all, we need it. There's this proactionary idea that we need to kind of get out front. The only way we're going to solve these existential risk concerns is with better understanding of science and technology. So we kind of need to get out front and be developing. So for instance, with AI, the risk from AI, we need to be developing AI safety technology. With the risk from bioterrorism, we need to be developing better countermeasure technology. So there's the proactionary principle argument. But then there's also an argument that really the benefits outweigh these risks. So I see both of those. Most transhumanists I know are still very much pro technology. Let's move forward as fast, much quicker than we are now. But yes. that is it's a really interesting area to explore. Yeah, and I think that it's an area where a lot of your normal Christians would feel like everything is doomed, right? And that man is a fallen species, a fallen being, and everything's kind of doomed. But it's great to see like Christians that believe that we can make the world better. So and I hope that you can kind of spread your views within Christianity. I think it would help enormously.
Yes, I would agree with that sentiment, Dan. And both you and Dr. Rana have shared some fascinating thoughts on this question of progress and whether human action is sufficient or not to bring about a society. Some might call it utopian. I would say a society in which all of the contemporary problems facing humans have been solved or greatly mitigated. In my own view, I don't consider progress to be inevitable. I consider it to be desirable but contingent on various events. And I do recognize there could be cataclysms that could derail progress. We have had periods in human history where entire regions of the world went backwards severely. The very long decline of the Roman Empire was one such example. And I have actually recently expressed a concern in a conversation with Steele Archer that COVID-19 could be our Antonine plague if it leads to a cascade of other negative events and crises, because Rome never quite recovered from the Antonine plague in the late 2nd century. It was never at the same level of technological or economic advancement since that time, despite efforts to restore it by various later emperors. So we do have to be cognizant of that risk, and we do have to take proactive steps to avoid it. But at the same time, in my view, the desirability of this technological progress, of achieving a scenario along the lines of what Ray Kurzweil envisions, is quite evident. And I see it not just in terms of material well-being for humans or longevity, though those are clearly key motivations. I see it in terms of reinvigorating a sense of meaning, because I think what Dr. Rana and I and many transhumanists have in common is this desire for people to recognize a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose in their lives, a sense of why they should care about living well in this world, improving this world. But that's not a sense that is shared by everyone in our society. There's a whole segment of, let's say, postmodernist thought, which tries to actively deconstruct meaning and say, well, it's all a fiction, why do we need this? And I would say I would have less in common with those people than with Christians who seek to kind of reinvigorate or restore a sense of meaning in people. As an atheist transhumanist, I clearly see some shortcomings in the specific modes by which Christians or proponents of any other religion would approach meaning. But that to me is not as important as people doing good things in this world for whatever reason. And I think ultimately transhumanism, more than being a philosophy, it's a program for certain changes that we would like to see in this world. And if people arrive at these changes from one perspective or another, that's of secondary importance. The primary importance is we see these advancements manifest themselves in the world because they'll change the parameters within which we interact. And they will change those parameters to allow for better interactions, more productive interactions, more positive sum interactions. So those were my thoughts. And it seems like, Micah, you wanted to comment on this as well.
I just wanted to kind of put in a potential plug for religion here. I actually take Tom's point from earlier that religion is very dangerous. Right? Historically, religion has been very dangerous. Religion and technology are very dangerous. They both unleash kind of like extreme possibilities. And so when they go bad, they can go really bad. And when they go good, they have some really good possibilities. But so we want to make sure we're using both of those in the right way. And what Dan was saying about this question about losing kind of the naivete about progress kind of highlights another side of it, which is that it's very easy to flip from being really naively optimistic to being really destructively pessimistic. And so you hear people like Elon Musk talk about being truly afraid of AI. His interview with I'm blanking on his name, but when he was talking about the danger of AI, he says things like, we're summoning the demons, right? So Elon Musk is speaking in some ways more like a fundamentalist Christian than like a secular, like atheist person, because that fear is real. And once you get beyond the ability to say, well, this is predictably going to get better, all of a sudden you steer really hard into what the dangers are. And so then the problem becomes, what if, like Dan was saying, we enter a period where things are going backwards, or things are not advancing, or things are becoming cyclical, and we just keep trying the same thing over and over again? How do you keep going in that kind of situation? How do you, have the confidence and courage to keep pursuing science and technology and learning and the well-being of your fellow humans while you're in a situation like this? Historically, religion has been the best thing for that, right? Like, the people who have truly deep religious commitments are the ones who are able to kind of keep going through those hard times. And I think that might be the other side of this to look for, not just the naive optimism that we sometimes see in transhumanism, but also some truly destructive pessimism that can arise as well. And I think we might need to keep both of those more in mind as we go forward.
Very interesting thoughts, Micah. And it seems that your claim to one of the principal values of religion is, if we are in an age where we're not currently living through exponential progress, where all areas of life are visibly improving for people, religion could provide some sense of meaning that gives people the motivation to continue despite that, and continue essentially resisting the tide of decay or regression. And that's very interesting. Now, over the past 5 years, I do think humankind has gone off the rails in a sense. And this is what Dan was referencing as well. I do think this started around 2015. I think objectively, we entered a trajectory which was not one of the best possible. And there could be a number of factors to explain this. But I have to reflect on how I personally responded to this as an atheist transhumanist. And one of my key responses was to attempt to use the US Transhumanist Party as a kind of bulwark against the degeneration of mainstream society, where I have sought to create a culture in this organization that resisted, for instance, the erosion of the norms of civility. And sometimes the result has been imperfect, to be sure, because we are flawed humans, and we have flawed tendencies ourselves that we need to be on the lookout for. We're not transhuman entities to the same extent that we would like to be. We have some elements of that within us, but we all still have to deal with the problems of our evolved psychology. But it seems to me the sense of meaning is something that can be found also in the individual and in the efforts of the individual. If one has this deep-seated conviction that no matter what happens on the outside world, no matter, even if one is engaged in a Sisyphean task of rolling the boulder uphill only to have it roll down again, it's still worthwhile to try to counter that tide of decay and ruin, essentially. So I think there is a deeper ethical commitment, not so much that, we embrace progress when it's happening, but we act as agents of progress in our own individual capacities, no matter what's happening around us. So that would be how a secular transhumanist could view this situation. And hopefully through our efforts, we can inspire others to do the same, whether they're religious or secular, and help stem the tide of recent events, and perhaps get into a better place. If Dr. Rana is correct, that COVID-19 is going to raise the salience of these technological advances and technological approaches to fighting disease in the minds of the general public. Now, Tom, it seems that you had some comments to share.
Yeah, just in general, and like Dr. Rana, I prefer to have this conversation more between James and Micah and Newton and he. You know, I brings to mind this idea of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And as a transhumanist who questions life extension, as a Gnostic who questions Christianity, I think I made some friends here today, inadvertently. But one thing that keeps coming to mind as far as you talk about tension of motives and the theology of things, as a conservative evangelical, I'm assuming, Christian, Dr. Rana, I know that the second coming requires an apocalypse, requires a tribulation, requires some real downside to civilization. So how do you reconcile the desire for the second coming with because I would think transhumanism really fits the mold of whatever the Antichrist would be. So how do you reconcile wanting to bring an apocalypse and fighting an apocalypse?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, and the thing is that the common view that many people have of Christian eschatology is what's called a premillennial view, where there's going to be this period of tribulation, this apocalypse before the coming of Christ. But there's other views of Christian eschatology as well that some evangelicals would embrace, like all-millennialism or post-millennialism, that doesn't necessarily require that kind of apocalyptic meltdown in order for the second coming to happen. And even if you adopted a premillennial view where you viewed the apocalypse as being inevitable, I think our mandate as Christians is to have an optimistic perspective and to do what we can in the here and now to make the world better. That even though that there may be an apocalypse awaiting us, that between now and then we do everything within our efforts to make the world a better place. And so you are living, I guess, in that tension. But it is a tension, but I don't think it's necessarily kind of an incoherence, I guess.
So Tom raised a very good question indeed. And I do not think that transhumanism is the Antichrist. It's very interesting because I actually am working on an article about Antichrist. So it's amazing that Tom raised that question. Well, in general, I think that Antichrists are actually among us, right? It's already here, but I'll elaborate that more on a different, form. But anyhow, so transhumanism, I believe, it's just it basically uses science and technology to improve, humanity, which is given. Because like I mentioned before, Jesus did so much to save people's lives, right? To make people feel better. He got rid of sickness and illness from people. So we are basically doing the same thing with science and technology. And so the question is, second coming of Christ. That's a very interesting thing. Now, if you remember that Jesus said that you will never know when he will come again, right? If it's so obvious that, look, bad things are happening, more and more bad things happening, and then Jesus comes, then we all know when he's coming, because, we just look at how many earthquakes that we have and, all the pandemics that we have. But guess what? He hasn't come yet. So it's not so simple like we think that, oh, he has to have something, really terrible happening, then Jesus comes, the second coming of Christ. But that's not the case. There are a lot of things in the Bible that we don't understand exactly what it means. So again, I believe, Tom, you were saying that, how do people put the Bible, put the books together, what's included and what's excluded and things like that. Yes, it's a lot of mysteries. but it doesn't negate the fact that, you know, faith is a good thing. People put faith into many things, right? If you talk about utopia, the Amish people believe that they already have it. It's utopia to live in the Amish community. All right. So we should give that, you know, say, okay, that's great. You know, how the way you live, you know, what you believe in is all good. But it doesn't mean that you should be anti-science. It doesn't mean that you should pollute the earth, right? Pollution is bad. We all know that. But people keep polluting the earth. Why? Because of economic things, because of capitalism, because of, you know, selfishness, all kinds of things, or ignorance, right? A lot of people are ignorant. So it's important that transhumanism help people to look at science more and believe in science more. At the same time, they have their own faith in religion. Now, that's not unique to Christianity either. You know, we're Buddhist, we have, you know, other religions that are equally good. It's just that, you know, the notion of God may be a little different than Christians' notion of God, but the idea is that, you know, we all should love one another. We should, you know, help each other to become better human beings and to understand the universe better, to understand spiritual side as well as the physical side of matters. I think that is, you know, that's a good thing. So instead of generating, you know, conflicts among religions, among science, and you know, among the religious and atheists, we should actually all work together. We should all work together because we have so much common ground. If you think about it, we all want to live a better life. We all want to have a, you know, some meaning of life. You know, nobody wants to, you know, live a life without thinking, without, you know, doing good, without, you know, helping people. And I think deep down, we're all good people. We just have to know how to, you know, achieve that goal. And so for myself, of course, you know, I'm more affiliated with fundamental Christianity. But again, you know, I can be a Buddhist, I can be, you know, someone else, and I think I will still be a, you know, firm transhumanist. Doesn't matter what religion I've chosen.
Yes, thank you, Newton. And this reminds me of a conversation I had with a gentleman at RADFest in 2017. So RADFest is the world's largest life extension conference. And this gentleman was a Christian, a Catholic Christian, who spoke with me about theology for some time and some of his concerns about transhumanism. But I asked him essentially, even though you believe in an afterlife, even though you say you don't want immortality in this world, would you want to live to 200 years? And would you support advances that would get you to live to 200 years? And he was a bit on the older side, but he said yes. He thought this was a wonderful prospect if he could get this great increase in the number of years of healthy life. And then I essentially told him, well, this means that you and I are on the same side, that we are seeking common goals for at least the foreseeable future. And then once we get to the point where all humankind can reach a life expectancy of 200 years, then we can talk about whether you want to live beyond that. And of course, we believe that's an individual choice. I happen to think that if someone does get to live to 200 years in a youthful, healthy state, they're not going to want to die the next day. But I think that's a good bridge into our next talking point. And Dr. Rana, going back to your video, you speak in that video about technologies that are aimed at fighting disease and overcoming immediate societal problems like hunger and poverty, which you clearly support. And you stated also in this conversation that you support technologies that at least get us close to what you've characterized as a utopian society. But you draw distinctions between those technologies and technologies aimed at what you call human enhancement. So you seem to be, at least in the video, more skeptical about technologies that don't actively cure a malady, at least as we would understand it today, but for instance, would give human beings the ability to run really fast or fly like birds, or maybe even live far beyond the contemporary, what appears to be maximum lifespan of around 122 years. So the response that many transhumanists would have is that there really isn't a clear delineation between technologies aimed at fighting disease and technologies aimed at human enhancement, considering that much basic medicine today would have been considered a magical kind of enhancement in past years. If we think of, say, artificial hearts, or if we think of stem cell treatments being able to cure wounds that once would have been fatal. If we think about the fact that a lot of people are cyborgs today already, they have functional prosthetics, they have hearing aids that connect to the brain. Stephen Hawking was able to communicate his ingenious ideas with the twitch of a lip because of the artificial interface that he had with his robotic wheelchair. So it seems that the line between curing a disease and human enhancement could be quite blurry. And it may well be, if it's easy to engineer human biology, that we can all run a 4-minute mile in the year 2100, that people will think back on our time and will say, well, these humans of old, they really didn't have access to the best opportunities for health, because look, they couldn't run 4-minute miles. Only a few of them, the world record setters, could do that, but now we can all do that. So is there really such a bright line between curing or solving problems and human enhancement?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think in the video, again, probably my full position on this didn't come to light, just because, again, I was trying to make a quick point that was maybe perhaps binary in the way that I expressed it. But I'm actually highly sympathetic to the point that you're making, that I do believe that what the line between what is a quote unquote a medical treatment versus what is an enhancement is, again, rather blurred. And for example, a few years ago, when this scientist in China, created the very first genetically engineered human beings, his goal was essentially to disable the gene that encodes for the CCR5 receptor protein, which is the protein that the AIDS virus docks to gain entry into the target cell. Presumably you could create human beings with that, loss of that gene without having any kind of other, phenotypic consequences that would be considered to be harmful or to the individual. And so the question then becomes, if you could create human beings that would be genetically and inherently resistant to certain viruses, is that a medical intervention or is that an enhancement? And so I actually do agree with your point that that line is actually blurry. And I don't actually have fundamental issues with people seeking out enhancements if I think there is legitimate reasons for people to have those kind of enhancements. Though intuitively it seems to me that there's a line that you could probably cross where you at that point would compromise human identity and maybe even human dignity, or that there's a line that you could cross where suddenly, this brings up the idea of the salvation paradox, that we could alter ourselves to such a degree that what we've created isn't actually human beings anymore, and then what we've actually have saved is no longer us, but an entity of our own making, and that as a result, humanity as we truly are today is actually driven to extinction and is replaced by something of our own making. And so that's again something that I've heard labeled as the salvation paradox. So it seems to me that there's intuitively a line that we probably, or I would feel uncomfortable crossing, but frankly I don't know where that line is or how to articulate a framework to even determine where that boundary is. So to me it's again an intuition. So I don't have fundamental issues even with enhancements, as long as, again, we're not compromising ultimately human dignity and sanctity, or the identity of human life. Um, you know, one thing that I am, concerned with in a pragmatic sense when it comes to enhancements is the potential inequity that it could create within a society. We already right now are struggling with, unequal access to healthcare, and it's particularly true in the United States, but I think it's also true in other parts of the world as well. And it's because as medical technology progresses, it becomes more expensive, and the resources are limited, and so everybody can't gain access to it. And so we already are in a world with medical haves and have-nots, and those people that have access to better healthcare have advantages, and those advantages then create another generation of people that even have greater advantages, where that disparity widens. And when it comes to the prospects of using technology for enhancements, I think you run even a greater risk of creating kind of a world of technological have and have-nots. And that's a concern that I also have related to the idea of enhancement. So not fundamentally opposed to it. I can't see any reason theologically from a Christian, conservative Christian perspective to be opposed to enhancements. But I do have a sense that there probably is a line we shouldn't cross for both ethical reasons as well as for reasons that I think are centric to my view as a evangelical Christian. That is, the dignity and the sanctity and the identity of human beings is very important to me.
I can add to that. That was wonderful. So, well, they say the sky is the limit. So I think there's really no limit as to how we want to enhance ourselves, whether we want to, fly like a bird, okay, because it makes us happy. So why not? I mean, God doesn't say that, no, we cannot fly. God created us that we cannot fly right now. But who knows? Maybe 100 years from now, we all can fly. Okay, that's okay. Now, what's not okay, or what's the upper limit? The upper limit is what we do with enhancement, right? Because the devil, Satan, wanted to become God, and that's when he fell from grace, right? So, what we are trying to do to ourselves and to help civilization in general, if we say that we want to become God, I think that is the issue. If you want to become God, we're going to fall from grace, and obviously we do not need salvation. We do not need Jesus if we are God ourselves. So we can never be God because we need Jesus' salvation. We need, to be saved, basically, right? That's the whole idea of Christianity, basically. So, and I still believe that, regardless of science and technology. So I think that is the limit. Now, in terms of equality, I agree with you totally. I mean, again, it has nothing to do with transhumanism. Way back, right? Way back before you even have anything. People who are rich, who are more well-to-do, who are more well-protected, obviously they live longer. Okay, and people who have to suffer, people who are suffering are usually the poor people. They're exposed to weather, the elements and harsh elements and so on. Of course, they are in bigger danger of getting eaten by wild animals. Okay, so it has been throughout history like that. Science and technology just bring it up front more. Like, today, if you have a computer, you have a calculator, of course you do better in school. And whether somebody you cannot afford a calculator, they can, they're not so they cannot excel so good even in school. So yes, we do need access to computers, access to internet, access to medicine, access to food and shelter, all these things, in order to have a better civilization. I totally agree with that. It's that's the whole idea of the gospel. Jesus, right? Jesus came to help the poor. He didn't come to help the rich. He came to help the poor. And like if you look at his disciples and followers, we didn't see many rich and powerful people. We saw a lot of poor people, sick people who needed Jesus' help. And that's why I totally agree with a lot of religions who are actually focusing on helping people who are in need. And I believe transhumanism, as we advance our knowledge and capability, we should give those things available to everyone who wants it. Okay, we don't want to force it on anybody. But if you need it, if you need it because you're sick, or if you need it because you really want to fly for whatever reason, yes, we should give them the opportunity to do so.
So how do you, in a practical sense, nothing to disagree with you really, Newton, but how would you, in a practical sense, ensure, the equitable access to, again, these potentially incredible technologies? I mean, it's one thing to say that's what we want, but my concern is, in a practical sense, knowing human nature, and the selfishness of human beings, that we always have had haves and have-nots, but it just seems like the real potential here is to exacerbate that, beyond the struggle that we've had throughout human history. So practically, how do you do that?
That's why we need politics, right? Politics is what we need, because, okay, let me see. Right. So scientists are good in what they do, right? They invent things, they give us computers, artificial intelligence, and so on. The question is, we still have politics, right? Government deciding what the regulations, we have lawmakers and so on. Absolutely, politics is, we have the United States Transhumanist Party, California Transhumanist Party, and so on and so forth. We call them parties because we are in politics, not just science, not just technology, not just religion, but politics. So, I mean, even Christians, right? Christians are very much into politics too. We talk about how should we, should we have this, regulation? Is it, Christian-like? Things like that. We question ourselves, like, what would Jesus do, right? That's a big question. What would Jesus do? Is it the right thing to do? And that, if we can get the right people in politics, transhumanists, Christians who are, open to, who are not anti-science but pro-science. So we get all these people in politics. I think it will help a lot in bringing equality to a lot of people.
I'd like to add to that, because Dr. Rana had a question about how to establish equality in the society with the help of transhumanism. So I think Christianity and transhumanism are intertwined, specifically regarding the equalism point of view. Because transhumanism without Christianity or any kind of religious ideology is empty. It becomes pointless. If we have an ideological basis, a pillar of religion within the transhumanism, then we can build a better life for everybody and establish equality. Because technology is like the apple in the Garden of Eden, if you look at it this way, and it's up to us whether we create heaven or hell on earth using technology. So if we choose to create heaven, we need to provide a better life for everyone. And transhumanism in particular needs to switch its focus in its attempt to establish a dialogue with the Christian churches. Like, the way to switch the focus is not to think about being immortal all the time, but actually think about how we can provide to the poor, how we can feed the hunger. And the way to feed the hungry is to actually create the unlimited resources with the help of technology. So the way to do that is actually very interesting. Transhumanism is able to do that through reproduction of resources with the help of technology. Someday, I believe it will happen. And that's when the most courageous dreams of our ancestors will come true.
Yes, I think reproduction of resources is definitely one of the transhumanist aims. I will say transhumanists can derive meaning or ethical foundations from many different sources. They don't have to be religious, they could be, though. And as an atheist transhumanist, well, I'll point to philosophy as a more general category of a discipline that one could use to derive meaning. Religion is a subset of philosophy. It's a popular type of philosophy for various reasons. Some of them are historical. Some of them may have to do with human psychology and the kind of thinking that at least many humans, perhaps 90% of the world's population, inclined toward. But in terms of access to resources, in terms of abundance for all, I think those are objectives that both religious and secular transhumanists can share. And indeed, how to achieve that is an important question, because there are realms in which it's easier to achieve today as compared to other realms. For instance, Moore's law is a well-recognized phenomenon in terms of the growth of computer processing power, and that has allowed so many devices to become much more affordable to many people than what the wealthiest individuals in the world could access a few decades ago. If you think of cell phones and the fact that cell phones were these clunky brick-like devices that only multimillionaires could access in the early 1990s, and they didn't work very well half the time, but these large brick-like devices were status symbols. And yet right now, a subsistence farmer in sub-Saharan Africa can have access to a better cell phone with more ability to get information than the president of the United States could 30 years ago. That's really remarkable. And that suggests that there is a trajectory with certain technologies that access does get democratized with time. When we encounter fields where that isn't happening, or isn't happening to the same extent, we have to ask why. And as Newton said, there are most likely political or structural barriers to prevent that from happening. And healthcare is an example where, for whatever reason, prices for even basic drugs or devices that have been available for decades have sometimes increased, have sometimes skyrocketed. We have to ask why that is, why that trajectory of increasing availability and affordability hasn't been followed within the healthcare industry. And that is a complex question to answer, but certain governmental restrictions on availability of care, on entry into the healthcare market, are in large part responsible. For instance, the US Transhumanist Party advocates repealing certificate of need laws that prevent the construction of new hospitals in various areas. We recognize particularly the need to rapidly build out our hospital infrastructure to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. We support, at the very least, greatly shortening the approval timeframes for the Food and Drug Administration so that drugs and medical devices do not have to go through efficacy testing in order to be made available to the general public. Instead, the efficacy testing could be done in the form of gathering data from actual consumers. And the regulatory agency should not be based on the precautionary principle primarily. It should be based more on a proactionary principle, where they also have to consider the risks of not approving that treatment, which are particularly salient now. If the conventional timeframes were followed and it were to take 5 years or 10 years for a vaccine for COVID-19 to be released onto the market, that would have devastating effects for human health. It is much more preferable ethically to release a vaccine that is probably going to be safe and is probably going to work, but we're not 100% sure. Because at the very least, we have a fighting chance to save potentially many millions of lives in doing that. So I think the proactionary principle and removing institutional barriers to the deployment of new treatments, as well as to competition in the market, is very important. And that speaks to, I think, some of the transhumanist solutions to problems that could be involved if certain technologies remain unaffordable for a long time. That's clearly not an outcome we want. We want these technologies to be as broadly available to as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. But I also wanted to ask Dr. Rana, let's say we have a situation in the future where in the year 2100, we're having a conversation like this. And it so happens that we're still using Zoom for some reason, and we look exactly the same as we do now. So we still look human. We have 2 eyes, 2 arms, 2 legs, all of that, except we've reached longevity escape velocity. And the reason we all look the same is we haven't senesced biologically. We've just kind of arrested our state of senescence. We're not even 200 years old yet. So that Christian gentleman I spoke with at RadFest would still want to live longer than that. Would you see any problem with that outcome at all? If we're still biologically human, we may have some artificial parts somewhere, but we still look, feel, think the same way. We just haven't aged because of technological interventions.
Yeah, I don't know that I would see anything fundamentally problematic about that kind of a future. That doesn't necessarily concern me. I think that if we do have human beings living, on average 200 years or several hundred years, I think it would mandate to some degree kind of a restructuring of society. But I mean, that's already happened as human lifespan has extended, even by just a few years. It's forcing us to restructure society. I mean, retirement today looks very different than it did when my grandfather retired. And so I don't know that that's necessarily inherently bad. It's just that I think we need to make sure that as we move potentially into that kind of a future, that we really understand what the implications are for the way society is structured, and make appropriate decisions accordingly. But fundamentally, I don't have an issue with that.
Great. I actually am quite encouraged to hear that, because I think for a lot of transhumanists, that is the future that they envision. I know there are some transhumanists who say, well, they want their minds uploaded into a computer, et cetera, but there are many who are skeptical of that route because they're concerned about whether that would really preserve their identity, or their I-ness, as I call it, their vantage point upon the world as individuals, or whether rather, if they're uploaded into a computer, maybe the pattern of their mind would be preserved, but they, as they are now, would not be directly aware of it. So a lot of transhumanists would say, at the very least, plan A is to continue in this biological existence with perhaps incremental enhancements, replacements of parts that wear out, but not just wholesale making a copy of yourself somewhere else and existing as a digital being necessarily. So at the very least, there's one major vision of transhumanism that you don't have a fundamental objection to. And it also seems to me religion isn't going away anytime soon. There are going to be Christians and Jews and Muslims in the year 2100, and Buddhists and Hindus and Taoists. So it would appear that there's no irreconcilable difference there. But I think this brings us to the last official talking point that I had. And this goes back to your statement in your video that if scientific medicine wins major victories against COVID-19, many people will recognize the power of science and technology to fight these kinds of threats to human health and well-being. And we would definitely hope that they recognize that. But to some people, religion might appear to be powerless and at best a consolation if they think, well, science and technology solved this problem of the pandemic, and religion didn't really contribute to the fight for whatever reason. But then if science and technology would lead to some tangible improvements in the proximate future, would it not be to the advantage of religious frameworks to adapt the best in transhumanism instead of resisting it or rejecting it as false? So if the concern is that perhaps the means that historically various religious denominations have employed to provide meaning or consolation or a sense of hope to people might appear futile in the face of a major pandemic, couldn't religions counter that by essentially taking some of the insights that you've provided and more explicitly integrating aspects of transhumanism and saying essentially, yes, we believe in Jesus Christ, or we believe in whatever theology we have, but also science and technology, they're manifestations of this, or they're somehow complementary to this, and you should be doing both, and you should be embracing all of this technological progress. What do you think about that approach, that strategy for various religions to undertake?
Yeah, well, that's a a great point that and great question that you're bringing up, and and I think the point that I've been arguing, and that many of us have been arguing today, is that indeed, Christianity is complementary with science and technology, and as a consequence, with at least significant aspects of the transhumanist ideal. So that idea of science and religion being complementary and being compatible and being in harmony is a very important concept that I think is overlooked by many people. Sadly, in our culture today, many people see this conflict model as opposed to this model of, again, integration and harmony between science and religion. And so, I would agree with your point that I think it is important for people of religion, for people who espouse the Christian faith, to really make the point that again, science and Christianity again are complementary, and that there's aspects again of transhumanism that I think Christians can very comfortably embrace, and I wouldn't say appropriate, but very comfortably embrace. But another point that I would like to make is we did discuss a bit about the Enlightenment, and that maybe the Enlightenment was the point where human progress began. I would actually argue that in many respects, some of the ideas of the Enlightenment actually flow out of Christian theology and out of this idea of our role as human beings, as having dominion over the creation, and that as a consequence of that we need to understand the world around us and take advantage of that. That idea of the Enlightenment, I think, flows out of, again, a Christian theology in large measure, where we're going to become lords and masters of nature, to quote Descartes, because in a sense that's part of the Christian mandate. And so I think that, again, that goes back to this idea of the complementary model that you're discussing. And I think it's also important to recognize that this is a controversial point, but there are a number of scholars who would argue that the Christian worldview played a significant role in the birth and the flourishing of modern day science. And it is true that science was born in a number of different cultures and a number of different contexts. But according to the Stanley Yockey, the Jesuit scholar, he argued that in those cultures, science was still born, in the sense that the worldview wasn't really providing a framework that would lead to the flourishing of science. But in Western Europe, Christian Western Europe, the Christian worldview created a milieu that allowed for science and technology to flourish. And so it's not only that again, progress through the use of science and technology fits comfortably with the Christian mandate, but I think that Christianity played a role in giving birth to science and technology, which we are today enjoying and deriving benefit from. And again, I think Christianity also has an important role to play, because ultimately the decisions that we're going to make, and this is a theme that has come up repeatedly today, the decisions we're going to make about what technologies we should pursue, how we should go about pursuing them, how we should deploy them, are ultimately questions that relate to ethics, and ethics has to flow out of some kind of worldview. And I think that the Christian system of ethics and the idea of the image of God is a very powerful concept. Whether you believe that or not, the idea that every human life has inherent worth and value, and that essentially should motivate how we approach the use and development of technology is a powerful principle that I would hope most people could agree to or could embrace. So I think your point is a deeper and a richer point than just simply out of convenience, co-opting, the objectives of transhumanism. I think there's a deeper rationale that flows out of Christian theology that would say that is in fact actually appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for those remarks. And it's certainly fascinating to consider essentially the interactions of Christianity and the Enlightenment. Of course, a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers were Christians, some were deists, some were atheists, but because the Enlightenment arose in a Christian context, one would expect that these individuals were at least influenced by Christianity. They were responding to it. They were either saying, yes, this is proper to use rationality to try to understand the world because you're trying to understand God's creation. The Christian Enlightenment thinkers certainly were very much of that view. Or some Enlightenment thinkers who were more of a deistic or atheistic perspective were challenging what they considered to be religious dogmas or obstacles to progress that were posed by Christian institutions. So, for instance, Voltaire or Diderot saw the Catholic Church at the time as being very repressive of scientific pursuits, and so they wanted to lift those limitations. John Carrots, who unfortunately had to go, left a comment that I wanted to highlight. He said, quote, "It is my belief that science and religion do not need to be at odds. The more we learn, the closer to God we can be." So he, in just that comment, very much expressed the view of a lot of Christian Enlightenment thinkers in that they were trying to understand God and God's creation better through rationality and through the scientific method. But historically, there very much have been conflicts within Christianity about the extent to which it was appropriate. And of course, Galileo, who himself was a Christian, essentially was saying, well, why in the world would God not want us to look at the stars and actually study how the planets move instead of making these dogmatic assumptions? But he got in trouble with the Catholic Church for doing that. And it seems to me that a lot of the reason why that happens in either direction, whether people of religious persuasions are open to progress or they try to shut progress down, it isn't so much based on whether they're adherents of a particular religion or interpretation thereof. It has to do more with both institutional factors and personality factors, like status quo bias. Some people will use any ideology to try to justify the way things are. And we've seen this in multiple contexts in history. There were Christian preachers who were saying, well, slavery is natural because the Bible explicitly mentions slavery. And there were other Christians who were abolitionists. For instance, the Quakers were some of the earliest abolitionists in the 18th century. And yet they all considered themselves to be Christian. So there's something else that's happening there underneath these self-identified religious denominations or convictions. And I would say it's the same with non-religious individuals. There's such philosophical diversity among people who call themselves atheists. There are many atheists who would disagree with everything I just said, and who would disagree with the pursuit of life extension, and who would say, oh, we are all just stardust, so it's no big deal if we die as individuals. We just return to the universe, and it would be unnatural to do anything else. And I would disagree with those people much more strongly than I would disagree with many Christians who do believe in the prolongation of life, or who do think that death is wrong and that immortality in some form is desirable. So I'm curious, Dr. Rana, what do you think is kind of the underlying differentiating factor between people who are open to this kind of progress versus people who want to restrict it in a very heavy-handed manner, be they religious or secular?
Gosh, that is the great question. And I don't know that I have anything that's profound that I could really add to it, other than I think it may be many times, if I could just simply speak with respect to my experience engaging Christians who would be in my community, conservative evangelical slash fundamentalist Christians. And I think many times people are, as Tom pointed out, are reacting out of fear. They're reacting out of the fact that this is something outside their experience. And when something is new and it's not well understood, people are afraid of it, and then the reaction is either to condemn it or to try to ignore it. And part of the motivation that I had for writing Humans 2.0, and I apologize for the shameless self-promotion here, was really to try. It's a book targeting evangelical Christians, helping them to be aware that transhumanism is an idea that we have to engage. I think is going to be the most important, influential idea in the next several decades. And B, it's not to, again, adopt a posture of condemning or ignoring, but rather engaging in a thoughtful way, born out of a real understanding of what transhumanism is about, and also trying to look for ways to build bridges and to find common ground, because it's in that framework that I think the value that Christianity has to bring to the table in terms of how we decide what our future is going to look like is going to be most likely to have the greatest impact. And so to me, I think that's probably the differentiating factor is reacting to the unknown out of a position of fear, or looking for ways to use concepts in Scripture to justify the status quo, as opposed to looking at concepts in Christianity with the idea of how can these ideas lead to a transformation of each of us as individuals, and a transformation of society in a way that I think honors the person of Christ. So that's at least how I would think of it from my own context. I don't know how to generalize that, but that's how I would think of it in my own context.
So
Yeah, I'd like to add.
Junaidi, so I just wanted to say, so I'm at odds. All right, so back to Tom's point about this being a debate or not a debate. This has not been a debate, but there's been tension, as everybody's pointing out. Hey, there's a tension. Here's a tension. There's a tension. There's been so many dichotomies here, and I just want to list them off very quickly. But first of all, I want to say, Junaidi, a lot of Christians I don't identify with, but I appreciate, you're an atheist, but I appreciate your intelligence, and I appreciate your compassion. I appreciate your professionalism, and you write children's books, and that's awesome. And I think that Christ moves through you, whether you are an atheist or not. Christ writes about the lost sheep, and how he'll lead the flock for any lost sheep. And I'm not saying you even have to acknowledge him, okay? I'm not even saying you have to acknowledge it. I think he moves through you anyway, and I see the power of Christ through you as a Christian, and I appreciate you. Now, I also wanted to go back to Betty. Betty talked about multiplication of resources, okay? That is a dichotomy with Tom said. Tom said, well, we're going to run out of resources. There's a main dichotomy there, okay? You also mentioned slavery, and so, one thing, we've talked about coronavirus. I just want to briefly touch upon another state of events in the world that's a big tension right now, which is racial tension. Okay. I have learned a couple things recently. First of all, Martin Luther King actually wrote about technology, and it was very profound what he wrote about technology. I have a good friend and she is a professor of literature at Spelman College. Okay. She's a professor of literature. Her name's Alexandria. She's African-American. But I'm going to read real quickly her research statement here. She says, my research is dedicated to exploring emerging technologies from past to present and the various ways that they affect human organizational systems, identity, and language. This inquiry pays especially close attention to the fact that information is a relatively new physical concept that connects science and the humanities. Through studies about segregated newspapers, the phonograph, internet pornography, and information leaks, I have learned about how human beings become interchangeable with data and corresponding systems of oppression, e.g. race, gender, nationality, economic status, etc. For example, tracing the documentation of Africans coming across the Atlantic in the 18th and 19th century American newspapers showcases some of the earliest census systems, as well as the complexity of accurately counting the buying and selling of human bodies. Moreover, fugitive slave ads demonstrate how the history of advertising in the United States functioned to architect a system of surveillance that could continue tracking Black people. Ultimately, my work is deeply concerned about how persons become quantifiable and retrievable through labels and taxonomies that systematize commodity exchange, dehumanizing as they claim to be neutral and efficient. It also considers how all this information and how all these new technologies disproportionately affects our survival. The scale of information and its impact on our ability to function in day-to-day life occupies my current projects. So now, and it's very brief what Martin Luther King says, and she actually did a keynote address for a Wikimedia event, and she did a keynote address for that. And I'd like to read quickly here. She said, all right, so rarely do we acknowledge MLK's theory of technological revolution in his essay, The World House, published in Chaos and Community. Similar to McLuhan's concept of the global village, MLK's World House addresses the social adjustments we need to make if we are to survive our misuses of technology. My talk addressed several of his claims, but I'll only address three here. First, King argues that all inhabitants of the globe are now neighbors. This worldwide neighborhood, neighbor is very Christian, has been brought into being as a result of the modern scientific and technological revolutions. Next, he claims that in this day of man's highest technical achievement, in this day of dazzling discovery of novel opportunities, loftier dignities, and fuller freedoms for all, there is no excuse for the kind of blind craving for power and resources that provoked wars of the previous generations. There is no need to fight for food and land. Back to what Betty said about multiplying resources, not looking at the limitations, okay? Science has provided us with the adequate means of survival and transportation, which make it impossible to enjoy the fullness of this great earth. The question now is, do we have the morality and courage required to live together as brothers and not be afraid? And finally, he concludes that the stability of the large world house, which is ours, will involve a revolution of values to accompany the scientific and freedom revolutions engulfing the earth. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. A civilization can flounder as readily in the face of moral and spiritual bankruptcy as it can through financial bankruptcy. Okay, so, you know, we've talked about, I'm just going to list a couple dichotomies real quick and I'm done, and one trichotomy that I think lies at the heart of everything. All right, we've talked about salvation versus corruption. We've talked about life versus death. We've talked about, you know, I think that we haven't explicitly talked about that, but St. Augustine talks about moral and natural evil, okay, which played a role in, we had mentioned Voltaire, okay, so Voltaire he was stuck on the natural evil. How can we have a good God? He was an atheist, and there really weren't that many atheists in the Enlightenment, there were mostly, but Voltaire was a very outspoken, decadent one. You know, and so,
I have to correct you there. One, Voltaire was not an atheist; he was a deist. Two, he was not decadent. He was very passionate about defending people who had been persecuted by the Catholic Church for heresy, and he even very prominently wrote in opposition to religious persecution. He was more an advocate of religious tolerance than anything else. So he wrote some essays critical of atheists as well, where I disagree with him, of course, on this, but I wanted to point this out for accuracy. But also, in terms of Voltaire's point of view, he enjoyed satire a lot. I don't see that as necessarily being decadent. I see that as being kind of a tactic to amuse people with wit, but to convey these ideas of religious toleration, reason, especially the idea that progress is real, but we don't live in the best of all possible worlds necessarily. So there's a room for human agency in improving the world, and it doesn't just happen automatically. That was the whole point of Candide, for instance. But anyway, continue.
Thank you for that correction. I really appreciate that highly. And one thing too, like you mentioned, Galileo being burned at the stake by the church, and he was, well, actually, I'm sorry, he was not burned at the stake because he backed off a little bit, I guess. Well, anyway, you know, geocentrism, actually the first one was Giordano Bruno, is a hero of mine. And it's like, okay, was he a Christian or was he not a Christian? He believed in magic, you know, he got burned at the stake. He also promoted geocentrism. So there's, you know, it's like there's still these frames of reference even within the institutions on, you know, and like I said, I was guilty before of you know, semantic. Okay, I labeled Voltaire, you know, I labeled him an atheist because I'm a Leibnizian, and I am a positive, not positive, say I do believe we're living in the best possible worlds, but I also believe that we have to make it so. That's kind of my little slogan. If we strive to make it so, which includes Captain Picard too. But anyway, so swords and a plowshare. So forcing people to have technology versus availability of technology. That's one dichotomy we've talked about. You know, that's one thing that transhumanists and Christians, you know, a lot of transhumanists, I've heard them say, well, Christians think that we're going to force them to have these technologies, you know, and that's one of these big tensions here, you know. So there's a forcing versus availability. That goes back to slavery versus liberation. Okay. And we talked about enlightening beings, beasts versus enlightening beings, self versus others. All right. Immortality for one or for all. Okay. So, you know, it's like, you know, someone made the point to me, like, yeah, all right. So if we achieve immortality for all humans, well, that means there's immortality for the human race. But does immortality for the human race necessarily mean immortality for each individual human, you know? And so, you know, but the trichotomy, well, the trichotomy at the heart of this that I think that we have is, you know, we've talked about ethics, we've talked about science, is metaphysics. And it's my opinion, you know, metaphysics, people shy away from, you know, but the thing is I think that everyone has a certain operating system, and that whether you're atheist, agnostic, Christian, Buddhist, whatever however you, even if you don't even have the time or inclination to define yourself in that way, I think you still have an I am this question mark at the heart of your being that you operate off of, and and this is one important thing too, that, you know, that we don't see that clearly hardly ever. We hardly know exactly who we are, where we are, because there are so many unknowns. We don't have this complete resolution of reality. So we do have to, all of us have to fill in assumptions and fill the gaps here. So, you know, one of those main assumptions is with genetics. Okay. So, we, you know, the KKK, they thought, okay, well, you know, we're the chosen people. We're meant to have immortality. We're meant to have heaven, you know, but we all can't have it. So, you know, some other people can't have it. And those happen to be, you know, people that look different than us or whatever, you know. But also there's, you know, the assumption about, you know, the genetic code is so complex, you know, can we just delete one thing and just boom, hey, you know, that's a lot of people assume that, but it's not. It's actually only 3% of the DNA. And Francis Collins was the director of one of the most successful human endeavors scientifically, which was the Human Genome Project. It was completed under budget, under time, and he is a deist, and he writes about logos, genetics, and, you know, only 3% of the genome actually directly codes for proteins. The rest of it actually self-references. You have what we used to call junk DNA that now we've found out, and Dr. Rana, you know way more than this about me than me. I have studied environmental biology. I worked at Wood Solar Oceanographic Institute. I've studied cytochrome P450 class of proteins and their associated genes. You know, but you know, just looking at your publications and everything, and you're a biochemist, you know, so you know, it's so complex. So we have to make these assumptions. Like, you know, if you don't study genetics, you don't know how complex the system is, and you think, oh, it's a linear code, and we can just chop a piece out, and we're good to go. You know, but that's an assumption. You know, that's an assumption that it's a complex system that we haven't quite totally figured out. You know, it's full of recursion, it's full of self-reference, and it's it's full of meta controls, and it's very complex. And that's a danger. That's an utmost power that we have. That I think Dr. Rana, you know, talked about earlier. You said that you know, we have this power at our hands that we have to be careful with, and I think that's your whole point here. You know, but metaphysics, the thing is that Christianity is not just about faith. It was built, you know, the New Testament was built, it was written in Greek, you know, so it was built upon philosophical, you know, Paul writes everything in this context. When you look at Revelations, when they're addressing all these temples, well, those temples are all within cities, these metropolises that all have, you know, various deities, you know, so it's like this, it's a network of metropolises with temples, philosophy, you know, and you've got all those different forms of deism together playing a role. And so I think that Christianity, but, you know, also, you know, we talked about Christianity, Enlightenment. Well, Islam preserved and stored, you know, throughout the Dark Ages and resurrected, one might say, a lot of the ancient wisdom, you know, and algorithm, algebra, that all comes from Islam as well. So, you know, we should not discount that fact either. You know, and, you know, so I think personally that if Christ does return as a person, as a physical being, that he may be a scientist. Okay. And the word apocalypse doesn't necessarily mean, it comes from Greek apocalypse. It actually means to reveal, to uncover. Okay. So the apocalypse, Revelation, it was all a dream. You know, it's the definition of subjective. It was a dream. You know, it's a prophetic dream. And, you know, so apocalypse means reveal, you know, it means to uncover. And, you know, so anyway, so information versus, this last point I'm gonna make, so information versus material, I think, is one of the main things at the heart of what we're talking about here with metaphysics. You know, are we gonna be, you know, if we are immortal from a transhumanist perspective, is it gonna be because we're uploaded to a hard drive in a virtual environment, you know, or is it because we're gonna have robotic bodies? Is it because we're gonna have avatars, you know, that can swim on, you know, Io or something like that, you know? You know, so, you know, I think this main thing is and I think we're on the cusp of this realization of reality, this theory of everything that's going to blow everyone's minds. And I think, you know, and I think that's the big reveal. I think that's the big reveal. And I think that's what it's going to be. And whether Christ comes back and says, hey, here's how it all works, guys, science and religion, they fit together, boom. Or whether Christ is actually a metaphysical system that comes and changes everyone's mind. You know, I think that's going to be something like that. You know, so anyway, I'm done. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, James. And before we go to closing comments from the others, first of all, you gave an overview of a lot of the issues and questions and distinctions that should definitely continue to be explored as people contemplate this conversation and where to go from here. Before I ask others for their closing thoughts, I wanted to share perhaps an amusing idea for a somewhat heretical science fiction plot that someone could write a very interesting novel on the basis of, and I'm just giving away this idea. But what if Jesus Christ was an actual historical figure, except he was a transhumanist from the 22nd or the 23rd century who accidentally found himself in the 1st century CE, except he had the benefits of certain technologies that he was able to bring along with his time machine. And somehow he has to fit into that society and appeal to the beliefs of the people in that society, so as not to be considered so weird that they would execute him or make life unbearable for him. So he presents the outcomes of actual future technologies in a way that would be plausible and would appear as miracles to the people of that time. And this goes back to Arthur Clarke's third law: any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So what if this person can actually levitate on water? What if this person does have some tricorder device and he could heal any ailment that he encounters? What if he can turn water into wine? And he does this until the authorities become quite wary of him. And then he does get crucified, but he doesn't die. He uses this technology to escape death. And then he appears afterward in a kind of resurrection scene. But what really happens is he finds a way finally to travel back to the 22nd or 23rd century. And his traveling back is the second coming of Jesus Christ. Kind of an interesting plot. I think probably one would have to be an atheist to write that kind of story. But apart from the time travel element and whether or not that's realistic, everything else is quite plausible, even from a materialist perspective. So now somebody watching this go out and write that kind of story, because I think it would be amusing at the very least for all of us to read it and consider whether we could imagine such a thing transpiring. But anyway, now let's go to closing comments. I want to bring in some people who haven't spoken yet. So Pavel, you helped organize this conversation. What are your thoughts now that you've heard all of the points and interactions?
Yeah, thank you so much. First, I would like to emphasize what Dr. Rana and Gennady said about Enlightenment. Even before Enlightenment, and during Renaissance, the humanists laid foundation for modern transhumanism, and they were Christians. For example, Pico de Mirandola, in his tractate on dignity of human, described the human as not finished project. Like God laid foundation, create basic human, and our job to keep working on it, to keep improving it. Also, I see transhumanism as advocacy for ethical use of technologies to improve condition of human existence. And usually how we deal with the new technology. We develop something, then we drop the bomb, and then we see the horror which this technology produce, and we start developing the ethics. So I think transhumanism is about develop ethics of the emerging technologies before we has it. So when we have it, we can use that in non-harm way. Yeah, do we have time for question or?
Yes, go ahead, Pavel.
Yeah, we can imagine a world where there's not, in addition to humans, we have other sentient beings such as AIs, uplifted animals, or any others. And I wondering what's Dr. Rana thoughts on creating a larger concept of we in which other sentient beings included?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and this is probably a whole nother long discussion. But to me, I guess there's a lot of discussion about sentience as being kind of that qualification for giving an entity, quote unquote, human rights, right, or affording that entity human dignity. And my challenge right now, my problem is I'm not even sure I know what exactly sentience is, or or if you can define it, how you would quantify it, and then say, well, this is the minimal level of sentience that you need in order to qualify for human value and human rights. And so right now I think, again, this is my perspective as an evangelical Christian, that what affords to me people rights is and dignity and value would be, again, this notion of the image of God, that human beings have a quality that distinguishes us from every other creature, that sets us apart, that by virtue of possessing that quality, that's what constitutes our rights. And so, to me, when we talk about maybe an AI system having, sentience or having self-awareness, again, I'm not sure how you would define sentience to make that determination. But another tendency, and this was raised very early in our conversation, a tendency that we have as human beings is to anthropomorphize. And that comes from the fact that we have theory of mind, where we recognize that others have minds like us, and we can anticipate what they're thinking, feeling. We have empathy for those other minds. And because of that, we then tend to grant those same qualities to animals, to automobiles, to inanimate objects. And my concern is, are we going to begin to grant human rights to something that we perceive as being sentient, like an AI system, which in fact actually isn't, but just is simply a very sophisticated algorithm that can mimic human beings exceptionally, but still lacks that genuine quality that human beings have. So I'm a little reticent at this juncture to use sentience as a criteria and then to grant the same human rights to anything that we would declare to be sentient. But that's again my perspective, shaped by my views as a evangelical Christian.
And on this point, Dr. Rana, I would be curious regarding your thoughts, if you have a chance to take a look at the Transhumanist Bill of Rights version 3.0, because unlike other bills of rights, this one has an extensive preamble that actually spells out what it would mean to be a sufficiently sentient entity to qualify for the rights in that document. So for instance, your typical insect or chicken would not qualify for rights, while a human would, but there are potentially other entities that would as well. So this could be interesting material for a future conversation. But now let's go to David Shoemaker. David, what are some of your thoughts in regard to what has been said?
Well, I will say today, thank you very much for our guests. Thank you, Dr. Rana, for coming here, and for the other people that have joined and participated so vigorously. I think that what's happened today is some of the most important thing that we as humans interested in a very positive future can do. I heard people say things that were very profound. I heard people say things that made me chuckle and things that I disagreed with, and it was all good, because we came into this with an understanding that this was a discussion, that this wasn't a competition, that it wasn't about one side's going to win and one side's going to lose. Back in my college days, I loved debate, and I would love to debate on different sides of issues. But that was to score points. That wasn't to really solve issues. Actually, it was to get a good grade, but that's another story entirely. But today, we're actually talking about understanding, and we're talking about one of my favorite things, which is a win-win situation. Or when you have multiple viewpoints, win-win-win, stretch that out as far as you want. And by modeling this, I think we go much further towards pulling people away from the extreme positions that we often find ourselves in. Science and technology can have their ardent supporters that create villains out of the other side, create saints out of their own side, and pursue to maintain their power base. In my view, that doesn't help. I want a very strong, very powerful future for all humanity, and then all that humanity spills over on to make things better, such as environment, such as the animals that we have. we can do far more for ourselves. But we do that out of a win-win situation. So I don't have to agree with you. I certainly like listening to everyone that speaks. And let's continue to model this. Let's look for opportunities where we can bring people together and have these rational discussions with an opportunity to learn from each other and perhaps show, maybe even sell, if you will, the idea that win-win is truly where we need to go for the future. I think that's a big part of what the Transhumanist Party is about, and one of the reasons that I'm happy to be part of this. So I don't have any questions. I just have thanks for all who participated.
Yes, thank you, David. And those are great sentiments, seeking win-win outcomes, especially in a world where we have such a diversity of perspectives, is really important. That's how we make progress toward results that we would all value, no matter what ideologies or worldviews or philosophies or religions we come from. So now let's go to Art Ramon Garcia. What are your thoughts, questions, comments?
I think it comes down to choice. As long as everyone chooses to become a transhuman, isn't forced into it, I think everything will go well. If at any point, choice is taken away, well, that's where problems happen. So, that's all.
Yes, and that is very important. And in the Transhumanist Party, we always advocate for individual choice to use or not to use certain technologies. So if someone wants to be like the Amish, they have the right to do that. If someone wants to accept certain technologies of the future but reject others, they have the right to do that. And that will be mediated in some manner by people's philosophical and religious beliefs. So with regard to Dr. Rana, your concerns about perhaps some technologies causing people to depart from what it means to be human, in a transhumanist future, those people would have the choice not to use those technologies, but only use what they think would strengthen their humanity or overcome human limitations. And I think that's very important to recognize. So now let's go to Inessa Lee. What are some of your final thoughts?
Yes, actually, I'm not Betty Boop. That's the first thing I wanted to say. I'd also like to sum it up. So to me, transhumanism without religion and Christianity is like a decaf coffee or a house without a foundation. And we don't need immortality in the world that is full of suffering, poverty, and social unrest. And therefore, I think that we need to aim at creating a new type of transhuman consciousness with a certain moral principles and values that are going to bring us closer to creating a better future. And technology for us should only be a tool in assisting us creating this ultimate paradise on earth, or a new kingdom free of toil, suffering, and pain that Jesus has envisioned for us. So, and also I have a last question to Dr. Frana about the image of God. As you have mentioned, the image of God has evolved in the course of human history. So how do you see the new image of God in the, neo-Christianity?
Yeah, well, the view that I hold, what exactly constitutes the image of God is debated by Christian scholars. And today there are three prominent views that are in play. One is called the resemblance view, one is called the representative view, and one is called the relational view. And in the resemblance view, which is the view that has historically been held by Christian theologians, the image of God refers to certain capacities that human beings have that in a limited extent resemble the capacities of the Creator. And it's these capacities that allow human beings to relate to the Creator and to serve as the Creator's representatives on earth. And so this would be things like an intellectual capacity, a moral capacity, a spiritual capacity, and again, a relational capacity. The other view, the representative view, is a more recent perspective that argues that it's essential, the image of God refers to our functional role in creation, it has nothing to do with inherent qualities that we have. And then the relational view is the image of God is a quality that designates our unique relationship with the Creator. And these three views actually are not mutually exclusive. All three views actually flow out of the biblical text in the Old and the New Testaments. So I tend to lean towards the resemblance view. In part, I think it's the historic view. I think it also has the greatest biblical support for it. So that's, I mean, what precisely is the image of God is actually heavily debated and has a lot of implications for things like how does Christianity engage transhumanism? How does Christianity engage the emergence of artificial intelligence?
Could you possibly refer to the image of God as AI?
I don't see anything in, well, I'm not sure I know what you mean by that question.
Well, you know, a lot of transhumanists actually envision God as an artificial intelligence. They draw a parallel between AI and God's intelligence. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I would argue that our capacity to understand what God is as a transcendent personal being is beyond our abilities as limited human beings. That we can only gain a partial glimpse as to God's character and God's true nature. And so I would be really reticent to equate AI to God. You know, is it possible that you could develop an AI system that could outperform human beings in terms of, you know, mental capabilities, quote unquote? I would say that's quite possible. But I don't think that, again, that system would still have that unique quality that human beings possess, which is immaterial in nature.
Yeah,
again,
I think that thought is quite dangerous, actually, for us transhumanists, especially when we talk about religion and transhumanism.
You think that saying that God is an AI is dangerous?
It's a little dangerous to me, I think, yeah, because that's exactly what could draw away Christians, you know, evangelical Christians. They would think it's, you know, related to Antichrist.
Interesting conversation. It reminds me of a time when I was actually applying to a college that wasn't officially Christian, it was non-denominational. So they accepted atheists like me, and they gave me a fairly generous scholarship. But I remember in the interview committee for that scholarship, we were discussing worldviews and philosophies, and I mentioned my support for technological progress as well as economic progress through the use of applied rationality, essentially. And it was a very humanist, proto-transhumanist type of view that I articulated for them. And they asked me, what room does that leave for God? And I have been an atheist my entire life, but I wanted to give them a kind of diplomatic answer that would lead them to identify with my position. So the answer I gave was, if it is the case that humans were created in the image of God, then shouldn't we strive to essentially be like God and expand our ability to know, understand, control the phenomena of the universe? So I don't know how that went over on them, whether that made the difference between them choosing to give me a 3/4 tuition scholarship rather than a full tuition scholarship. I will never be able to look inside their minds and understand that, or whether that helped me in their view to some extent. But suffice it to say, this question of the image of God is one that I've had to contemplate even as an atheist, at least in a practical context. But in any event, let's go to Dan Elton. What are your thoughts regarding this discussion?
Sorry, I just wanted to thank Dr. Rana for taking the time to talk to us, and I think you've obviously you've studied these issues, and I think that the overall, I mean, I would disagree with you on the theological grounds, as I am not a Christian, but overall, I think there's a lot of agreement here, and I think that we can work together to overcome some of the more naive strands in transhumanism, like the singularitarian type philosophies, and you know, which I think arguably have become a replacement for religion for some people, with a more nuanced and honestly more scientific approach. And I think part of that, I don't want to get on a digression, but part of this is understanding existential risk and understanding the technology and progress. And these are very complex issues. So yeah, I think it was a very wide-ranging discussion, a lot to think about coming out of this. So I think it was great. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dan, for your comments. And now let's go to Tom Ross. What are your thoughts? Has this discussion turned out the way that you conceived of it going in?
No, not at all. I mean, my whiteboard, unlike James's, which was very high-minded and metaphysical, looks more like a battle plan. And I'm glad I didn't go with any of those things, because I have such respect for Dr. Rana, his open-mindedness, his understanding of transhumanism. So at the last minute, I decided this isn't really a debate. That's not going to be useful. It's not going to be productive. This should be a discussion, which is why last night I thought of inviting Micah and James, because I tend to be, like I say, an antagonistic, and that's not useful in this instance. I think there's so much correlation here between both isms that needs to be really delved into, and I think there's just so much that could be gained by having these positive conversations rather than debates. Or, you know, I was thinking about when I was as a father, when my sons would be at odds with each other, I would often kind of do something to make them both be mad at me together, to join them, and they would together, you know. And again, as I said, as a Gnostic who questions Christianity, or a transhumanist who questions life extension, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and I feel like I made you two good friends here today, and that's my role. That's kind of where I'm comfortable, and I'm happy to do it. But I have great respect for Dr. Rana and his works, and I do hope this conversation continues.
Yes, thank you very much, Tom. And you definitely play a unique role within the transhumanist movement. It's a role that we need to sometimes challenge our assumptions, challenge our categories, even of classifying particular belief systems or persuasions. But if this is really about the exploration of ideas and the search for truth, then that is quite welcome. So now let's go to Micah Redding. What are your thoughts regarding this conversation?
Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me to be a part of it. I've definitely enjoyed it, and I'm grateful for Dr. Rana for being here. I'm glad that this kind of interaction was able to happen, and I've been tracking some of his work for a while now, and look forward to engaging with it more. I think that, as I suggested earlier, I think there are really strong reasons why Christians and transhumanists are talking about some of the same things, and clashing over some of the same things. And when sometimes we clash with the thing that is most similar to us, but is just different in some kind of key way, right? And so I think this is an area for a lot of really important discussions. It's going to be hugely important for transhumanists. It's going to be hugely important for Christians going forward. For secular transhumanists, I would say, there are billions of religious people in the world. You need to be thinking about how they fit into the future that we're building together, right? And for Christians, let's say, transhumanists are some of the people most advancing and thinking about what the future of the world actually looks like. It's really important for Christians to be engaged with those people in a productive, constructive way. And so I think that's where we need to go with this kind of going forward. And I just thank you guys for all being part of it and participating.
Yes, thank you, Micah, for those excellent and thought-provoking comments. And now let's go to Newton Lee. What are your thoughts regarding this discussion?
Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed the conversation. I think what bothers me today, actually, now is not anti-religion, it's about anti-science. A lot of people, for some reason, anti-science. Some of them are actually religious people, and that's really bothersome because science and technology is a part of religion, really. Like Gennady says, philosophy is the it's basically the foundation, and then in philosophy, religion, we have science, we have other things, music and art and everything like that. They all come from philosophy, really. And philosophy is about the nature of humankind. It's about humanity, right? There's no use for science, no use of technology, no use for anything if there's no humanity. So that's number one. Number two, I really love your idea, Gennady, about the novel. It is genius, yes. Everything is correct except that Jesus did not accidentally, end up in the, 2020 years ago. No, it was intentional. As I said, always said that there's so many coincidences in the universe, but it was actually I believe James he mentioned that Jesus is truly a doctor, a scientist, a philosopher, a spiritual leader, somebody who really genuinely loves humanity, someone who actually wants to improve the human condition. That's why he was sent here to save us, and he's still saving us by opening our mind. And therefore it's really sad to see people using religion as a shield or as an excuse to do bad things. They hide behind religions, they hide behind all kinds of flaws or ideals. Let's say people hide behind being a Republican, people hide behind being a Democrat, people hide behind being something, right, in order to promote the selfish agenda. And that is very sad because it affects the everyone looking at you and say, wow, Christian are bad people, or Republican are bad people, or Democrats are bad people. They're not bad people. It's just a few people who are bad, and they're using religion, you're using all these groups and ideologies to promote their own agenda. I think that is truly a very sad thing to do, a very bad thing to do. So hopefully, by engaging more people to talk about religion, talk about Jesus Christ, talk about transhumanism, talk about what really should politics be. Politics are not here to control people. Politics are here supposed to help society to be more manageable, right? To help everyone in society, every member of a country, not just certain groups of people in a country, but every individual in the country. And then if you expand it to world view, you talk about every country in the world should have equal access to to technology, to medicine, to human rights, and all these things. I think that's a very Christian thing to do, a very Christian thing to to promote. And I'm very happy to see that transhumanism basically is, it's pointing to the same direction as Christianity is.
Yes, thank you, Newton, for those remarks. And I think they speak to common values, common goals among human beings that we can agree upon and pursue whatever religion, whatever philosophy we identify as our own. And hopefully transhumanism can be seen by many adherents of different religions and philosophies as, at the very least, a practical program where there could be a lot of concrete areas of agreement, even if our reasons for pursuing those are different. So now, as is typically the case in our virtual Enlightenment salons, we will let our guest have the last word. So Dr. Rana, with everything you've heard, how would you sum up your perspective on this conversation, and perhaps how is your thinking different now from what it was when you came in?
Well, first of all, I just want to say again, thank you for having me. And you all have been very kind to me, far more than perhaps I deserve. And I love the fact that you had this idea to invite me here with the idea of looking towards finding common ground. And I think we have identified, again, places of common agreement, enough so that I think we could, in a practical sense, lock arms together and work towards, common ideals, common goals. And I think there's real value in the fact that there isn't necessarily total agreement, that there is differences, and that diversity makes everything more rich. It helps us, I think, flesh out areas that still need focus and need attention. And I'm also, encouraged by the fact that I do see even a deeper parallel and a deeper points of agreement between Christianity and transhumanism than I even realized while I was working on my book, and as I've sought to engage transhumanists. And I hope that we can do more of these types of things in the future, where we can have these kind of conversations. So yeah, I leave this time together really very hopeful, very encouraged, and developing a deep level of respect, I think, for what many people who are advocating for transhumanism really want to achieve. And again, from my perspective, how could you disagree with somebody that at the end of the day wants to make the world a better place? And how can you disagree with that? And what's also, again, encouraging to me is that many of the ways that transhumanists want to make the world a better place are ways that Christians want to make the world a better place. So again, I'm actually very hopeful and very encouraged, by this conversation, and would love to see more opportunities to discuss these issues.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Rana, for spending 3 hours and 17 minutes with us today. It was a wide-ranging discussion, hopefully enjoyable to our audience, and hopefully people will come back to it and glean key insights from it, because the recording will be available via the same YouTube link. And this is exactly what our virtual Enlightenment salons are intended to elicit, this kind of search for common ground. This is why we have outstanding and interesting guests like Dr. Rana. And this is what we shall strive to continue to do every Sunday at 1 p.m. US Pacific time. Thank you everyone for attending our virtual Enlightenment salon, and have an excellent remainder of your day.